A small room with wooden walls hid a boy with dark hair. His gaze was filled with surprise and slight fear. He muttered, not realizing what was going on. He stared into the mirror in front of him, searching for answers. And suddenly his reflection seemed to come alive, inquiring with bewilderment and excitement. And this? Who else? The boy could not believe his eyes. 3. The dazed boy stared into the mirror, touching his face. "What's wrong with my face? I look like shit," he whispered, trying to understand the reason for his reflection. Suddenly, the space in the room warped, and he felt the reality around him change. "What? Wait a minute," the boy muttered, feeling someone or something pulling him through the mirror into another world. The boy, full of determination and wonder, broke free of the mirror's captivity, now standing before a new, uncharted world. The light illuminated his face, reflecting the excitement in his eyes. After I was reborn, his musings dissipated as he realized that a new chapter of his life was beginning, a chapter full of suspense and adventure. Under the pressure of the new world and its unpredictable laws, the boy felt painfully cold. "It's so ridiculous to die," he thought, struggling with the reality where fate had thrown him. But suddenly everything around it was filled with light and energy. That's it." His shock interrupted him. He discovered a power that was awakening within him, responding to the challenge of this new world. In the face of the unknown, the boy met a light that symbolized a new status and power in this world. He realized that it was a new beginning and a chance to change his destiny. But the world gave him no time to think. "And you, wench, are going to follow him," came a voice full of anger and threat. Faced with his first challenge, the boy was ready to act. "Die!" the old man shouted in the frightened girl's face. A mysterious figure stood in the light pouring down from above, shrouded in a red-rimmed cloak. Her outline was vague, but she clearly took center stage in this new, mysterious world. The silhouette foreshadowed the new challenges and opportunities that await our hero. Energy pulsed around him as if inviting him to enter the unknown and begin the hero's journey. Light streaming in from above illuminates the armored figures as the mysterious hero stands before them. "What? You're still alive?" they shout out in surprise. "But it won't be for long," the dark figure replies, its voice full of determination and grim calm. A moment of confrontation ensues. "I must kill them all?" A thought flashes through her mind as the hero prepares for battle. Forces converge in an epic confrontation and the hero finds his purpose. Dark magic, demonic leap. And he leaps into battle, ready to change the course of events. In the center of the whirlwind of events was he, mysterious and inscrutable, as if a creature from another world. His body is clad in a suit like a space traveler. Every line on his clothes seems to be distorted by the speed with which he pierces the dimensions. The invisible wind of fate sways his wide-brimmed hat, and his face is hidden from the world like the most cherished secret. The darkness of the hero's face embodies the unknown, the unknowable. His eyes are hidden, but you can feel them piercing the fabric of reality, searching for answers to eternal questions. His eyes burned with determination and anger. He stood among the corpses of his defeated enemies, ready to repel any attack at any moment. In his hands, the hero firmly clutched the handle of a ball, which glistened in the light of battle. In the background lay a defeated knight, for whom the battle had ended in certain death. A figure in a dark cloak approached the man from behind. He dared to raise his sword against his sister. The hero's words resounded with inhuman anger. The man turned around and screamed in pain. He didn't expect such a harsh attack. The hero's eyes were green in color, reflecting inhuman hatred and anger. He was ready to cut down anyone who got in his way. It seemed that at that moment nothing and no one existed for him except his goal. The little girl looked away with an uncomprehending gaze. Her face showed fear and incomprehension of the situation. The city was on fire, smoke coming from everywhere, and the charred walls of the houses towered upward. The dark eye sockets of the windows, like the eyes of some monster, were black with emptiness. The man who seemed to be in charge here said that the guards said that the invaders had already left the city. There were shouts of joy among the townspeople. Now they were safe and nothing threatened their lives. A boy in a green hoodie was sitting on the side of the sidewalk with his hand over his face. Next to him sat a little girl who seemed to be trying to comfort him. It was obvious that there was some kind of close connection between them. A blue plaque suddenly appeared in front of his face, and the boy looked at it with a tired and serious look, as if trying to see something there. The tablet popped up with the information. Reincarnation awakening of the first level of the quest is complete. The study of dark magic is in progress. Suddenly, an indescribable pain began to cut through the guy's head. He tried to cope, but it didn't work well, and he clutched his head with his hands in an attempt to dull the pain. But he immediately fidgeted with himself, or smiling looked at the girl next to him, assuring him that he was fine. It turns out he'll get his new powers over time. A boy with yellow hair was approaching the rest of the townspeople with shouts of joy. He called out to his father, a man in a red hat. You could tell by the look on his face that he was very happy that all of his family and friends were okay. He said boastfully that he didn't want to say it, but the demon in the cloak that killed the humans was him. The boy lied, of course. Not believing his ears, the man exclaimed with joy. He couldn't believe that this little guy could handle everyone. The kid's name was Butch. In a joyful voice, B said that of course it was him. There was a reason why he had trained his magic and entered the Magic Academy. From under the hood, the stern and serious gaze of the protagonist was visible. Even though everything was behind him, he didn't let his guard down. When the townspeople heard this, they began to shout enthusiastically. Thanks to this boy, they were all saved now. There were radiant smiles of joy on the faces of the people. All of you gave honors to the young savior. With a haughty expression on his face, the guy said he didn't need any thanks after all. It was his long time to protect the inhabitants from the city. It was evident from his face that all these honors gave him indescribable pleasure. Finally, he said that if everyone wanted to see what kind of magic he used to defeat the humans, then let them look at his mansion. The protagonist looked in his direction unhappily. He was annoyed that this guy was looking for easy money and fame. In the background, the sunset was blazing scarlet. A huge-looking demon towered into the sky, his eyes burning with fire, full of sharp teeth. His little minions fluttered around him. A man with a sword was bravely fighting to the death. In a quiet voice, he told the kid he wanted to hear his story. How much should he give him? Bud turned around and looked in the direction of the protagonist with a disdainful look. In a mocking voice, he asked, "Did these goblins survive? How stubborn they are. They have a great will to live." Rising to his feet, the protagonist turned to him contemptuously. His sister grabbed him by the arm with her little hands and tried to stop her brother, and he was not pinned down. In a gruff voice, he said it wasn't the guy who killed the people. So why is he lying? When Butch heard that, he was embarrassed and asked what he was talking about. Why would he lie? Calmly and angrily, the guy said that since he wasn't lying, let him defeat him. If he won, Butch would confess everything. You could hear the grit and determination in the kid's voice. He was ready to face any challenge. At sunset, the sky was colored in fiery tones, adding drama to the scene where the two young men clashed in conflict. "Are you nuts?" echoed the indignant question of one of them as he opened his mouth wide in surprise and displeasure. The other, with pale hair and a calmer expression, took a step back, raising his hands in a gesture of defense or perhaps peaceful resolution. Their emotions were like an open book, bewilderment and perhaps resentment on the part of one against the other's eagerness to settle the heated dispute. Dusk dissolved into a glow of mystical light as the confrontation reached its climax. "Heh, and if I win, what will you do?" Book's voice sounded defiant. He was confident of his impending victory, but the fighting spirit in his opponent was stronger than his opponent had anticipated. With the sound of a powerful blast, the man in black released his energy, directing it against the blonde man. The impact was so powerful that the very atmosphere seemed to shake with magical energy. The blonde man spread his arms wide, stunned to realize that his opponent was not going to give up without a fight. The darkness dissipated under the mocking smile of Book, who met the gaze of his invisible opponent with confidence. He was like a star against the night sky, bright and unwavering in his self-assured brilliance. The gesture of his hand was light and graceful, as if he were conducting an orchestra of shadows, playing with the forces that were trying to engulf him. The space around Booch came alive, engulfed in a whirlwind of dark energy. His laughter cut the silence, as if he sought union with the darkness itself. Down below, facing the abyss, stood another, asking the fateful question, Did you really defeat an entire squad of men by yourself? The demonic creature asked snidely. In the darkness that enveloped Book, words full of confidence and challenge rang out. Well, of course. Don't you dare lie to me. I'm not lying, he shouted, pushing away from the invisible danger as if joking away from it. You are lying. For lying, you pay with your life. The voice was full of thunder, and every word carried the weight of immutable law. Well, all right. I snapped. Butch's confession came out of him reluctantly, as if he were still trying to play the situation out in spite of all the threats. The silhouette of the protagonist in dark attire towered over Butch, leaving him small and vulnerable against the giant figure. He was like an unyielding mountain standing between Butch and his freedom, a symbol of the looming threat. Sounded the lad's laughter, deep and confident, echoing through space, demonstrating his dominance. In the dim light of the monitor, a young man with blue hair stared tiredly at the screen. I couldn't get past her either, and she sucked me in completely. His words were filled with regret and fatigue from sleepless nights. The screen took over all of him, and with each passing moment the virtual world became more and more real, pulling him away from his everyday life. Butch found himself caught up in his own emotions, his face contorted with horror and confusion. Wah, he barely audibly muttered, trying to gather his thoughts in this maelstrom of events. Behind him the world continued its mad spin, and he seemed to have lost all connection with reality. Darkness enveloped the stage, and deep in the darkness, shrouded in an eerie aura, a man with blue hair became the source of a powerful spell. Dark magic, illusion, he whispered, and the air around him pulsed with otherworldly energy. Each word of his spell cast hallucinations on his opponent, trapping them in their own fears and deceptions. The clash of gazes was enough to subdue his opponent's will, plunging him into an endless world of darkness and delusion. On the sidewalk, under the careless stride of passers-by, Butch sat alone, exhausted and lost, his exhausted gaze staring into the void. Well, let's go, Leah. The protagonist's voice sounded soft, trying to rouse the girl lying unconscious. His hand gently touched her shoulder, his eyes read care and concern, waiting for her eyes to open again. Overwhelmed with excitement, the crowd of people stops the guy. Hey, wait, what just happened? Did you really took down that underground group? The voices of the people are full of disbelief and shock. In front of them stands the protagonist, whose expression is hard to read. There is more of a lack of emotion on his face rather than a clear display of it. Really? He replies, not paying much attention to the people's surprise, his own thoughts clearly preoccupied with more important matters. Against the backdrop of a soft sunset, two figures holding hands stride together on an endless path of transition and change. I have been reborn as the weakest goblin. The words, laced with sadness and reflection, float in the air while their shadows stretch behind them like echoes of past lives. This moment marks the beginning of a new chapter of their existence, where weakness is not an obstacle, but only a point of reference for future growth and development. In the green dust of the forest glade, two figures clashed in battle, the silhouette of a boy desperately waving his weapon and a goblin dodging a deadly blow. Yesterday I just finished off a goblin and raised my level, the boy recalled, his gaze reflecting mixed feelings. And then I fell asleep. His words are interrupted as reality begins to reach him. And became a goblin? The end of his thought expresses utter bewilderment and shock. The man's face displays complete disbelief at the transformation taking place. In the stream of soft violet light, the protagonist's face expresses determination and courage. I can protect my sister and me. His eyes sparkle with promise and unwavering faith in his own strength. The words sound like a vow made in the silence of the coming night, echoing through space and time. The kid looks in the mirror, his gaze full of contemplation and bewilderment. Although I look human, but my race is goblin, he ponders, trying to reconcile his new appearance with his unexpected discovery. The reflection in the mirror shows him, but now he sees himself from a completely different angle, contemplating his new identity. In a whirlwind of memories, the guy experiences an inner fog of terror and despair. Gah! A groan escapes his lips as the moments of his life flash before his eyes in a chaotic pattern. Scenes of happy days with his family, moments of fear and danger, struggles and escapes all create a mosaic of his current self, now trapped in the body of a goblin. There is panic in his expression, traces of tears on his cheeks. A girl's cheerful voice is heard outside the door. "Brother, get up, it's morning already." The silhouette of his little sister appears behind the door. The guy slowly comes to his senses, still feeling the remnants of the night visions. "Give me a couple minutes," he asks, trying to collect his thoughts and separate the dream from reality, while the day promises new discoveries and challenges. Lily, waving her hands happily, rushes over to share the news, filled with anticipation of a surprise for her brother. I made my brother the most delicious lunch today." Her voice sounds cheerful and proud, reflecting the warmth and comfort of a homely morning. The main character's face reflected a radiant smile. His eyes shone with happiness as he looked at his little sister. This was the only person in this evil and cruel world that he loved and tried his best to protect. They were walking down a street full of strangers. Each of them was in a hurry somewhere, on their own business. Without a doubt, the protagonist fell into the world of the game Frontier Fantasy. The setting and surrounding atmosphere coincides with the world of this very game. He threw a dark hood over himself, almost hiding his face. Based on the memories of this body, Nod and his sister lost their parents and now live together. Now they have many challenges to overcome and adapt. A neat house with a tiled roof stood, raising its little turrets into the sky. Suddenly his little sister tripped over a pebble that was lying on the road and was about to fall to the ground when her brother carefully picked up her body, trying to hold her up. She almost dropped the small basket of groceries. Turning around, Sis smiled a welcoming smile and thanked her little brother that she was perfectly fine. She felt protected next to him, and there was nothing to be afraid of. The main character looked at her with a calm and full of concern look. The guy said that her little brother would always look out for her. The girl smiled and said in a cheerful voice that since she was blind, she only had to rely on her big brother. Despite her disability, the girl was an incredibly cheerful person. Looking at her, the heart of the protagonist was bursting with happiness and the desire to protect her. The boy shook his head. He would protect her even though he said so. He is a goblin, the weakest race possible. He was thrown into this world, but why? What should he do now? Many questions swirled in his head. They were walking along the city road, the protagonist carefully looking around to not miss a single danger, and to protect his little sister, who due to her blindness could not do anything. Soon they came to a large house with a red-tiled roof. It was the mansion of a black market merchant. I went to the door and waved goodbye to my brother. He said in a caring voice that they would see each other later. Right now, he had other more important things to do. Mostly he does all the errands since his sister is blind, but she still does some chores around the house. The merchant, dressed in luxurious red clothes, said in a commanding voice that they should get him black ore. The boy looked at him from under his hood and mumbled quietly that he'd do it. He didn't want to do it, but he had no choice, and the old man was annoying him. Soon he came to a mine with mountains of black ore in the background, which he had to extract with hard labor. The boy was pulling a heavy wagon filled with ore. It was unbelievably heavy, but he went forward, overcoming the difficulties. Suddenly, someone struck the wagon with a naked kick. It faltered and was about ready to fall. After a second, the wagon still tipped over and the black ore scattered. The boy fell with it. The one who overturned the wagon was Butch, the same bastard who lied about saving the city. His henchman stood beside him and ordered the protagonist to move. The boy silently put the wagon back in its original position and began to collect the ore. He did not say a word, for he realized that he could do nothing in this situation. His face showed disgust and irritation. Butch's henchmen were standing next to him, talking admiringly. One of the guys said that only members of the elite society were allowed to go there. Butch ironically confirmed that it wasn't easy to get in. It was evident that the guy had an unshakable authority among his friends. At this time, the main character was quietly gathering the black ore back into the wagon, paying no attention to his abusers. Walking back, Butch said mockingly, "What a pity, at this rate he won't even have time to eat." The protagonist tried hard to suppress the urge to punch his assailant. Damn, it still sucked. He now had to work hard to support himself and his sister. In addition, He had to endure insults from people in high society. According to the map from the mansion, 125 years have passed since the main events in the game. His age corresponds to his human age. The guy was sitting down, breathing heavily. The work was finished. Next to the mansion were the mountains of black ore that the guy had worked so hard to mine. Suddenly he saw something in the distance. His eyes widened with surprise and even fear. The armored man stood surrounded by a blinding light. His armor bounced off the sunlight and his whole body seemed to glow. The kid looked at him worriedly and how they got here now. He had to deal with that problem as well. A second later, a horrible realization flashed through his mind. His eyes widened even more and his teeth clenched even tighter. Memories of past events began to flood into his mind. He remembered his sister and the many people running. They were confident that the guards would protect them. The boy remembered more and more events. They're in the interior of the continent now, aren't they? Has the dominance of humans increased so much in all this time? Concern could be heard in his voice. This is different from the plot twists in the game, that it wasn't. In a whirlwind of rapidly unfolding events, the knight in shining armor was cutting down a huge number of monsters. He was swinging his sword in different directions. It seemed that at this moment nothing was impossible for him. The sharp blade of his sword seemed to be cutting space itself. It also brought to mind the moments when the leader of these very knights, with a wry smile on his face laughing, said that this is what happens when you challenge people, and called them bloody monsters. It was the memories that apparently made the guy uncomfortable. In unconsciousness, he opened the door wide, and rays of light penetrated the dark room of the room. He called his sister's name, trying to find her. There didn't seem to be anything to worry about. The little girl sat in the corner of the room, shrunken into a lump, and didn't seem to notice anything. The main character ran up to the girl and hugged her. He grabbed her and dragged her behind him, telling her that they needed to go quickly. The girl, still not fully realizing what was happening, whispered her brother's name. Suddenly, they were hit by a crowd of people running. Among them was Butch. He rudely pushed the protagonist away and told him not to get tangled under his feet. Following them, the doors swung open and the old man appeared in the doorway. A predatory smile gleamed on his face. The boys had not been able to hide in time, and now this man had noticed them. The protagonist shielded his sister, trying to protect her from the unknown danger. Now anything could happen. The little girl looked at what was happening with unseeing eyes. The kid realized that he couldn't overpower this man, and yet he couldn't give up. He shrouded his sister even more tightly. She would not even be touched with a finger. He ordered his sister to act now. Determination glistened on the boy's face, but he didn't have time to do anything. The man swung his sword and a huge energy wave hit the body of the protagonist with force, throwing him back a respectable distance. He didn't even have time to squeak. The boy carefully stroked his little sister's cheek. He looked at her with inexpressible love and tenderness. All this time he tried his best to protect her from any danger. Lily was blind from birth, but if he used high-level magic on her, there was still a chance. Perhaps the girl's eyes will open after all, and she will finally see the whole wide world. The boy will finally see her beautiful, deep eyes. Soon the two of them found themselves in a fairy tale forest. The protagonist was sitting on a stump, apparently thinking about something. His sister was sitting on a rock next to him, wiggling her legs in the air. The guy was pondering. Based on the game description, goblins are the weakest race on the continent alone. They are very weak. However, in a group, these creatures can cause problems. Some of the goblins have special powers, and also this time has a high reproductive ability. The main character's eyes were made sad. And yet is the goblin in danger of total extinction? In that question, it was as if he was rebuking himself. He looked at his sister, who was enthusiastically playing with the little fairy. Raz and humans began to actively conquer the continent. This created many problems and dangers for the goblin race. His gaze was downcast, but why did it have to be like this? It wasn't my question that stuck in his mind. It was one of the many questions he couldn't quite answer. In a defiant tone, Fairy asked what he was going to do now. Her voice sounded reproachful. The protagonist continued to sit on the stump and prepares to take decisive action. For starters, there are a few things to check out. From the beginning, he needed to see what abilities he had unlocked, and if he could help the village with his skills. In front of the protagonist, Tablets began to form on which the skills were described. Though he replenishes his skills with them by completing quests, but they are pumped up pretty low. They are even displayed in a strange order. Chances are, the program lacks a full skill tree. Skills, his status increased as well. The guy scrutinized what was written, but suddenly his face transformed and a slight smile appeared on it. There was still hope, and it was the only hope that had kept him warm all this time. Having finished studying his skills, the protagonist walked over to the one that was not far from him. Well, now it was time to test what he had learned. He swung around and hit the rock with all his might. The sound of the impact was powerful and pieces of earth flew in different directions. Cracks crawled across the rock. Well, he had definitely pumped his strength now. His sister, along with the fairy, looked on in surprise and clapped their hands. Their eyes were filled with unconcealed delight at the boy's achievement. Following that, the protagonist used dark magic, and the purple smoke from the spell flew in different directions. The spell was so powerful that it looked like it was going to break in space. Lily squeezed her eyes shut and covered her ears at the loud sound. The fairy flew backwards, thrown by a gust of wind. It looked like the guy had pumped up his magic skills. The sister held the stunned fairy in her hands. Tanya could move a finger. At the same time, the protagonist was studying with interest a piece of paper on which his characteristics were written. This sheet stated that he now possessed the enhancing magic Shadow Guardian, Dark Pulse, Shadow Camouflage, Shadow Threads. He also had healing magic, Dark Healing Magic, Goblin Affinity. In addition to that non-verbal attack magic, Jinx, Dark Illusion. Now that all these magic powers were organized, things would go much easier. The guy smiled. A lot of things had changed since the humans attacked. He now knew how to use dark magic. That would make his future journey much easier. The protagonist's face became serious. He rolled the paper into a bundle and hid it under his hoodie. Together with his sister, he headed towards a stone that was in a small clearing not far from them. On this great stone were depicted some obscure magical symbols. This structure was more like a monument. The boy looked at him with a serious look. This memorial was built to honor a goblin hero, and on this spot, he must cast the most important spell. The main character's eyes lit up with green light, and the magical space around him began to thicken. Snippets of the Great War surfaced in his mind. The many goblins who fought bravely for their freedom. Hobgoblin. Their serious, determination-filled faces came to the protagonist's mind as if bringing back memories of past events. The image of a goblin priestess popped into his mind, a beautiful girl whose eyes burned pink. In addition to that, the image of the goblin general surfaced in his mind, a supreme warrior clad in shining armor. Next to the silhouette of the guy, the goblin fairy was flying. She was smiling and looking somewhere far away with a cheerful look. Lily asked in amazement, how was that even possible? Her eyes opened wide, expressing all her inhuman amazement and delight. The main character, in a calm voice, began to speak. You could hear the determination in his voice. Once every 1,000 years, even goblins give birth to individuals with incredible abilities. It's very rare. In front of the protagonist stood a huge goblin knight. They were heroic souls that had come to life through the boy's efforts. They would do whatever he said. The goblin general bowed down on his knee before his savior. His eyes, though not visible, seemed to express inhuman gratitude. He knelt before the protagonist and in a submissive voice said that from now on they would heed his words. They would follow their savior safely wherever he went. In a confident tone, the guy said that he wanted to defeat the demon army and the human army. In those words was his whole dream, a dream of revenge. He wondered, could he have been talented all his life? But his abilities could only manifest themselves in a critical situation. The boy stood together with his sister. Above them towered the souls of the great goblins. This army was ready to tear apart anyone who stood in the way of his savior. Now, a completely new age was beginning. Lily looked at her brother in surprise and fear. That's it? It wasn't my question that froze on her lips. Guy smiled his good-natured and full of care smile at his little sister, at the person for whose sake he had done all these feats, and whom he was ready to protect from any danger. The kid put his hand down on his sister's head and stroked her gently. He looked at her with unbearable love and tenderness. Tears came to Lily's eyes, tears of gratitude, and her brother was able to heal her. He's unbelievable. The little girl cried tears of joy and settled down with her brother. She was incredibly grateful to him for working tirelessly to protect and heal her. Suddenly, something strange began to happen. The heads began to develop an incomprehensible blue color. Lily was frightened and looked at it all with a frightened, uncomprehending stare. Her brother became alarmed. Out of the blue light came the little fairy goblin. There goes her new job. Well, if that's the way she wanted it, it can't be helped. Though her voice was displeased, she seemed to accept it. The main characters looked at what was happening with fear and incomprehension. The little sister cried out in surprise. Soon the goblin fairy fully revealed herself and said that she had been assigned a mission to guide the two of them to a hidden goblin village. In front of them stood a small girl with white hair and wearing a short black dress. She had two small glowing wings behind her back. She looked at the protagonists with curiosity and a kind of disdain. There was interest in the little creature's eyes as she drove her eyes around, studying the main characters. The boy looked at the guest with distrust. He wasn't sure she didn't carry danger for them, so he had to be wary. They followed their new acquaintance without saying a word. The green forest was impenetrable around them. It seemed that even the air in this place was imbued with incredible magic. But still, they had to be on the lookout. Who knew what lay ahead? Goblin fairy, huh? All this time, the protagonist looked at the newly arrived guest and pondered. It all appeared to him a strange coincidence. Why did she come to this world? The boy's eyes were distrustful of everything that was happening. All he wanted at that moment was to protect his little sister. In this world, no one could be trusted. Suddenly, it was as if Faya felt his non-trusting gaze on her. She turned to him and gave him a stern look. The guy immediately berated himself and said that everything was fine and there was nothing to worry about. Soon they arrived at their destination. The protagonist stood in front of the entrance to the village. The goblin fairy happily announced that they had arrived. Magical continent, a hidden goblin village. Surprised, the boy said that he didn't realize that goblins had their own village. He figured it was never mentioned in the game either. Calmly lying on Lily's head, the goblin fairy said that a concealment spell had been cast on this village. So no wonder the guy didn't know them. The protagonist exhaled unhappily. The fairy flew away. Telling the protagonist to follow her, she would guide them to their old age. The boys looked at her with surprise and incomprehension. But still they followed her. As they walked down the main street of the village, all the villagers turned to look at them in surprise. It was as if they were seeing a new visitor in their village for the first time. Seeing these perplexed looks on them, the guy turned around and thought, "What's happened to them? Why are they looking at them like that?" Little goblin children surrounded Lily and asked her to play with them. The girl was confused and didn't know what to say to them because there were too many of them. She was even a little frightened by the reception. She glanced at her brother as if expecting some kind of protection from him. The boy looked at her with a surprised look. The fairy said that the girl didn't have to be present at their meeting, so if she wanted to, let her stay. To his sister, and told her that if she wanted to, she could play with those kids. The girl nodded cheerfully to him. The girl nodded happily to her brother. The boy thought that she had only recently gained her sight after all. She must want to have fun. Let her rest for a while. She has had a lot of trials and she deserves a rest. Soon the lad came to the old man's house and was already sitting across from the old goblin. The old man sighed and said that he hadn't realized there were still goblins outside the village, so their prophet had been right. One day, a young man would come to the village with a goblin fairy. All this the prophecy said. The old man said that according to tradition, he was obliged to give the young man their hidden treasure. The room was illuminated by the warm light from the fireplace, filling it with a kind of homeliness. The guy wondered, who the hell is this prophet? So that's whose voice he heard when he died. The old man asked the kid to wait a second. He'd bring it all over. The old goblin rose from his seat, and with a shuffling gait went somewhere to the side. The goblin fairy immediately flew over to the kid. She said that the villagers were very kind and welcoming to visitors, but still the boy looked at all this with disbelief, because it was the first time he had been in such a situation. I continued in a sad voice. She said that the fate of goblins is not enviable. All the monsters despise them for their appearance and way of life. From this, their existence becomes even more harsh. And for humans, they're like bugs. People call it natural selection. They only use goblins as consumables to gain experience in this game. But then the fairy's voice became confident. She said it was all complete nonsense. After all, they are just popping their mouths out day by day. The boy lowered his head, thinking sadly about all that had been said. For a second, he even felt ashamed. It was true, in the game, the goblins were the weakest opponent for the player. But he never thought he'd be in their shoes. Now he would have to experience it for himself. He took off his mask and looked at everything that was happening with a surprised look. Now he was in the skin of the same goblin that he had slaughtered by the thousands while playing this game. Now he too was about to learn all that the enemy private would face. He was lying on the ground, his consciousness shrouded in darkness. Drops of blood were visible on his face. He was now the one he had been killing all along. After a while, the headman returned and handed the boy a small bundle of paper. The boy looked at the gift with interest. He unfolded the roll of paper and began to study it with interest. The fairy flew beside him and also looked at it with her pink eyes. From what the guy saw there, his eyes widened with surprise, and drops of cold sweat began to trickle down his face. Without turning around, the elder said that their lives are once and too fragile. It was all because of the exile. Inexpressible sadness and sorrow could be heard in his voice, but at the same time there was nothing he could do about it. The old man continued. He said that the existence of this race would soon come to an end. Time listened attentively to every word, and with every moment my heart began to beat more frequently. The old man turned to the newcomers one last time, a thick gray beard on his face. In a quiet voice he said, "Once for the goblins could survive." He didn't finish immediately, as if he was going to put his thoughts in order. The guy would have wanted to say something, and the old man was already walking backwards and heard nothing. The protagonist turned his gaze and saw that there were many goblin children standing at the window of the house. They were carefully watching everything that was happening inside, and as soon as he saw them, the children headed in the opposite direction. Soon they were inside the building and standing in front of the guy. It was as if the children were gathering their thoughts to say something important. It was obvious that they were very afraid and shy. Still overcome with embarrassment and fear, they chorally began to ask the protagonist to save their village. In the eyes of each of them was sadness, fear, and terror. It was evident that they had to face many hardships to at least survive. Now these children had high hopes for the protagonist. Soon the rest of the villagers appeared at the door. They were whispering anxiously among themselves, discussing what had happened. They realized that it was the boy from the prophecy. Their voices were full of joy and hope for a bright future. Unexpectedly for the guy himself, all the inhabitants suddenly fell to their knees and began to tearfully beg him to finally save them from centuries of oppression and save their race from total extinction. The protagonist just stood there staring at them, not understanding what he should do in such a situation. He had too high expectations, which he was afraid he would not fulfill. Soon he was bored with it all, and he just closed his eyes and fell into oblivion. Right now, the most he wanted was to finally sleep. He closed his eyes and tried to sink into the abyss of sleep. His body felt like absorbent cotton. He was awakened by someone's loud voice. Someone was telling him to get up right now. The boy woke up and looked around frightened. In front of him stood a woman dressed in white, her white long hair developing in all directions, and on her head were two large horns. She looked at the protagonist sternly and displeased. Apparently it was she who woke him up after all. The boy looked at her with surprise and consternation. Who the hell is she? His eyes were filled with confusion about what she wanted from him. The stranger replied that she was a goblin goddess. A bright white and blue color began to flow around the woman. The guy looked at her and still didn't understand anything. Who the hell is a goblin goddess? What does she want from him? But suddenly it was as if he began to remember something. That's right. In the headman's house he had seen a mural of a woman with two. That must be her. He thought about it and tried to understand what was happening. It was similar to the one he had seen in the elder's house. Guy thinks that even the lowest of monster tribes should have their own deity. Well, here it is in front of him. Although at first glance you wouldn't know it. She looks more like a seductive succubus than a goddess. The girl was looking sternly at the protagonist at the time. In a stern voice she asked, "Did he just think of something obscene in his little skull?" Her voice calmed down, and she said she would tell the boy why she had decided to award him with a portion of the divine power. I turned stern. The boy continued to stare at her with an uncomprehending gaze. He was curious to know why he was the savior everyone had been waiting for. The goddess began to speak. Tens of millions of goblins were brutally slaughtered. During their countless campaigns, they were treated as inferior life forms. It is said that they are in this position because of their helplessness. But it is for this reason that they are also the strongest. The boy finally stopped understanding what he was talking about. He tried to comprehend how being in such an unenviable position could accomplish anything. The goddess said that it's all about the ancestral legacy of this guy who took all the power from her fallen brethren. Now he's concentrating untold power in his body. They all wish to protect what they hold dear. They also care about the protagonist's little sister. The goddess looked at the boy with serious, stern eyes. Lily's smile came to mind, the way she cared for her older brother even though she was blind. The goddess closed her eyes, and a bright light began to stream around her. With sadness in her voice, she said that in the future their imminent demise awaited them. The boy opened his eyes. It turned out that he was only dreaming. He stared upward with an uncomprehending gaze, trying to come to his senses after such a realistic and strange dream. Bright rays of daylight were shining through the window, filling the room with warmth. Nature was raging outside the window. There were bright sandy colors of young leaves. He jumped up from the bed and looked at his hands with a surprised look. The dream had made a lasting impression on him, and now he needed time to recover a little. His gaze was full of determination. He was determined to change everything. He would create a new and safe world for them, where every goblin could live without fear for his freedom and life. The boy sat down at the table and began to write quickly with a pen on a piece of paper. In a minute it was ready. The fairy hesitantly asked if he was sure it was a good idea. In a confident voice, the protagonist said that it was fine, and he shouldn't worry about it. The boy looked out the window and looked at what was happening outside. He wanted to create a world where all the villagers, and his sister, would live in harmony and prosperity. And for that he needs to defeat one of the kings of the demon army that rules this territory, namely King Dior. At the moment, Dior lives on the grounds of the magical academy he founded. The boy was determined to change everything. If he became an outstanding student at the academy, everything could work out. Lily would have to stay here. The protagonist stroked his sister's head, as if reassuring her that everything would be all right and she shouldn't worry about anything. The boy pulled his hood over his head and told his sister not to worry. He would be back to her very soon. He had a soft and gentle smile on his face, trying to make it look like everything was fine. His little sister, there was no need to worry about anything. The girl looked at her brother with a worried look. She told him to be careful. Next to her, Fairy floated in the air and yawned with boredom. All these long goodbyes were foreign to her. The fairy said that she had plenty to do in the village, but it was more interesting to look after the boy, so she would go with him. The boy walked out of the house and looked into the distance. It seemed that the academy was that way. A rough shout came from outside. It was followed by an apology. The boy looked over to the other side. A big, heavy man was sitting on the crates with his foot forward. A girl was leaning down beside him, apparently cleaning his huge shoes. The man pushed the handcuffed girl away with his foot and she flew in the opposite direction. With a predatory smile, he said that was enough. Late for the deal. The man treated this little girl like a thing. People began to whisper, and there were shouts of displeasure and concern. The man seemed to be up to his old tricks again. He always gets so angry when his slaves don't behave perfectly. Goblin slaves have an unenviable life. Fairy was angry and said that this bastard was a low-ranked demon himself, but was boasting over the weaker ones. She really wanted to hit him hard. The protagonist turned his gaze to the fairy and told her to take care of that girl. The fairy immediately flew towards her. The guy might as well not have said anything about it. At this time, the protagonist crouched on one knee and began to apply the dark magic of the goblin bloodline. His eyes lit up with a violet flame. He put his hand forward and a magic symbol immediately appeared on the road. The spell worked as it should, and dark magical energy flooded the area around him. Soon, and from the thick of the dark mist, the goblin priestess appeared. She opened her eyes and looked up wearily. The priestess stretched sweetly. How long had it been since she had visited this world? Her voice was full of joy and excitement. The woman asked why the master had called her. How could she help him? The fairy crossed her arms over her chest and said dismissively that the girl was being too frivolous for a heroic spirit. The boy said, embarrassed, that he knew it was a rather sudden request, but he wants the priestess to do something for him. He pointed his thumb backward. The priestess looked at him in surprise. The guy continued, pointing to that little girl slave. That man kept on abusing her. The girl was already lying exhaustedly on the paving stones, unable to move a finger. From such treatment, few people could stay on their feet. People began to whisper worriedly among themselves, but none of them dared to come closer to help the poor girl. Pushing the crowd, the protagonist made his way forward. In the depths of the dark alley, where the light of the lanterns barely pierced through the shadows, two men stood. One, a formidable man with a distrustful gaze, stared at the small figure before him. "Listen," the boy began, but his voice trailed off. The hooded figure, with its face hidden in shadow, remained silent, only its eyes betraying hardness and determination. Who else are you?" the man asked, not hiding his surprise and growing interest. The sun had already risen, and its rays played on the man's gold jewelry. "You don't want this girl, do you? So give her to me." The guy's voice was confident and commanding, as if he was used to having his orders obeyed immediately. "What? Why would I give her to you? She's my slave, I bought her." There was irritation and disdain in his voice, as if he was talking about a thing and not a person. The one who stood in the shadows asked the last question. His words were quiet but crisp, and there was a sense of power in them. "So you don't want to get rid of her?" The gold on the man's fingers shimmered in the sunlight as he laughed, waving away the stranger's offer. "Of course not," he said, the confidence in his voice emphasizing that the case was closed for him. But the hooded figure was in no hurry to leave. "Well then," she began, and a smile appeared on her face, full of confidence and some inner knowledge. He extended his hand as if offering a deal that could not be rejected. This slave paying 100 times of her original price. The voice sounded firm, the offer was made, and the time for a decision was ticking away. Surprise cut through the air as the man exclaimed. His face contorted with shock, his eyes widened. This was a sentence he hadn't expected. "What?" His voice shook with bewilderment and indignation. He couldn't believe the seriousness of the terms. But the boy didn't hesitate. "Or is that not enough?" The words were spoken calmly while a priestess appeared from the shadows, deftly carrying large sacks of gold. The man's gaze was now filled not only with shock, but with the painful realization of defeat. The story is nearing its denouement. The light of the gold coins dazzlingly plays in front of the man's eyes. Well, there's all 300 gold pieces. His voice trembles, sounding unsure, as if he still can't believe the reality of what's happening. "Are you sure, kid?" His gaze is fixed on the glittering treasure, searching his interlocutor's eyes for confirmation of the seriousness of his intentions. "Yeah, sure," replies the shadow, and there is not a trace of doubt in her voice. "They are all yours." The words are final and decisive. The deal is done. "So we have a deal?" You can sense the firmness of the decision in the hooded figure's voice. "Keep in mind the goods are non-returnable," says the man, sealing the deal with words that tolerate no objection. The man, dazed and elated, is unable to resist any longer. His eyes are filled with happiness. His hands rest on the bags of gold. The morning light washes over the cobblestones of the street where a new chapter begins for the freed girl. Her gaze follows the departing hooded figure, whose silhouette melts into the warm air of morning. The girl's sea-wave-colored hair wavers slightly in the cool breeze, and she is left sitting on her knees, absorbed in the sudden freedom and surprise of the moment. Footsteps in the distance, like echoes of a past action, fade softly into the morning noise of the city, leaving behind only questions and a silence filled with gratitude and hope. We now have before us an open-air street where the two figures, the liberator and the liberated, are already away from the exchange that has taken place. But why? "Uncle." The girl with green hair cannot understand the reasons and motives for what has happened, her voice trembling with mixed feelings of gratitude and confusion. "I'm a Govian like you too, little one. That's why I saved you," says the hooded figure, turning to the girl. Her eyes glow with warmth and understanding, for her own stories and struggles echoed in her words. The girl with green hair looks at her savior with bewilderment. But where did that uncle go? Her voice trembles, still trying to make sense of the events that have changed her life dramatically. The savior doesn't answer, only smiles a parting smile at her, and the next moment his figure is already dissolving into the sunlight-filled street. Won't it? The girl barely audibly whispers as the reality of her new freedom begins to dawn on her. I've known about this since the game. His voice booms out, filled with confidence and cunning. The air vibrates with unholy magic as a mysterious silhouette appears out of the darkness. The goblin priestess has the special skills of stealth and ghostliness. Her stealth allows her to approach the wagon of a hobo unnoticed, while her ghostliness allows her to pass through the walls of the wagon. Her actions reek of coldness and mystery, and she seems to be an integral part of the shadows that surround her. A mysterious aura fills the room as the goblin priestess deftly picks the lock. Her actions are swift and precise, set in motion by long-standing knowledge and magical ability. They belong to me anyway, and cheating people that bad isn't so bad. Her voice is quiet and determined, justifying her actions of stealing to herself. We cannot allow the slave trade to flourish in our new world, she declares, emphasizing her determination to change the world for the better, even if she has to go to extreme measures to do so. The girl with green hair standing alone ponders the words of the priestess, reflecting the complexity and multifaceted world in which they both exist. The goblin priestess confidently declares, Master is such a balderdash, said only I can handle it. Her smile is full of pride and self-confidence, and she is clearly enjoying her role in this stealthy operation. The next moment shows a guy reaching out to a girl with green hair who is sitting on the ground. This gesture is filled with care and hope for a new beginning. The girl stares at him in amazement, her eyes full of questions and her mouth slightly ajar in surprise. Then suddenly, like a lightning strike, realization comes to her, and she cries out in disbelief. The realization dawns that her chains are forever broken. Gratitude blossoms in the girl's heart as she extends her hand to her savior. Thank you, sir. Her words are sincere and full of gratitude. The lad, for his part, asks, Take this little girl to the village. Yes, yes. His tone is commanding, but not without kindness. She knows the girl needs help with her first steps to freedom. The savior, his mission accomplished, turns to the girl. And I'm off to the entrance exam. His words are light and casual, as if he's just getting on with his normal day. The scene ends with his departure, while life around him continues and two white doves take off into the sky, a symbol of peace and new beginnings. Henceforth, he says wistfully, contemplating the bright horizon and the new possibilities that are now open to both of them. The protagonist, turning back, says with confidence and hope, A new history will be written. She prepares to step into the unknown, driven by a mission to change the world. A gate opens before him, symbolizing the beginning of a new journey and the countless opportunities that lie ahead. And in this world where magic and talents are valued above gold, everyone with a gift can find a place. Also, anyone can take part in the exam, and if you have the ability, you will be unconditionally accepted for training. These words carry the promise of justice and equality, where everyone can succeed through effort and hard work. Before the assembled masters and apprentices, a figure in a dark cloak demonstrates his incredible abilities by manipulating dark flames. This unfathomable talent is astonishing and awe-inspiring, and though its wielder is hidden from view, his power is undeniable. The clenched fist gesture expresses determination and control, symbolizing the willpower that guides and curbs magical energy. It is a reminder that true power lies not only in magic, but also in the ability to control it. Amidst the noise and movement of the academy, the cloaked voice sounds like a command, organizing and directing the future mages. Students that are going to the entrance ceremony, line up in a row. The voice of a leader leading them to the beginning of a new life full of learning and discovery. On the street, where the ritual of farewell is repeated again and again, students meet and separate, their friendly smiles and jokes filling the air with lightness and joyful hopes for the future. Among them is one who has just taken the first step towards his dream, hidden in a cloak but no longer alone. A boy leaves familiar places, rushing into a new tomorrow. His gaze is hidden, but in his heart is a quiet confidence. This world promises endless possibilities to those who dare to seek them. And so he stops, turning toward the call that may prove to be the beginning of his most important chapter. There is no telling what he will discover beyond this gate, but he has already taken a step forward. Before the gates of the academy, like a ghost of the past, she appears. A girl with golden hair and elf ears, her eyes blue lakes of amazement. She is suddenly confronted by a traveler shrouded in the shadow of a cloak. Her gaze is filled with questions, and her lips barely whisper, She steps toward him, genuine curiosity flashing in her eyes. There is a note of childish joy and carelessness in her voice as she makes a request of him, almost as if she were playing a game. "Do you have any food with you?" And without waiting for an answer, suggests, for example, something sweet. The protagonist, hiding her emotions behind an impenetrable cloak mask, suddenly finds herself the center of her attention. She, a creature of light and warmth, and he, a mysterious wanderer, present a contrast that only an academy of magic can put together. 261. The protagonist, whose face is barely visible under the hood, pauses thoughtfully for a moment. His hand shakes uncertainly as he extracts a small package from his pocket, a gift he had never thought to use in such a way. He realized that this chocolate was made for him by his sister. Along with the small bag, he extracted a note with words of encouragement written on it. Without waiting for a response from the boy, the elf girl snatched the pouch from his hands and rushed in the opposite direction. The boy didn't even have time to say anything in response, but just clutched his empty hands. The elfess shamelessly began to munch on the chocolate that was not meant for her. Her face immediately showed an emotion of joy and happiness. When he saw it, the main character screamed with horror because his sister had made this chocolate for him. And now some stranger is impudently devouring it. He bent over, ready to cry from grief. The girl finished eating and shyly thanked the boy, who was bent over and ready to fall under the ground. The boy turned around and looked at her with a look that could burn any man. The girl wanted to say something, but when she saw the look on the boy's face, she stopped short. There was an awkward pause in the air, and then the girl started laughing nervously. It looked like she'd done something she shouldn't have. A chill ran down her spine, and she was going to get the full brunt of it. She immediately folded her arms and began to beg for forgiveness. She didn't know that this chocolate was made by his significant other. The protagonist only glanced at her with contempt. The girl didn't know where to put her fear. She had just eaten a chocolate that wasn't meant for her without even asking. God, it was like she'd opened a gateway to the underworld. The guy was looking at her like he was about to tear her apart, and it looked like he was. The shy elf girl thanked the boy again and said she would pay him back. She introduced herself. Her name was Letty. After that, she asked the boy happily, what was his name? The protagonist lowered his head and looked down. He didn't know what to say, so he hesitated. After a moment's pause, he said quietly to himself that he had no name. For all his life, he lived as a slave of the lower class. They don't give names to people like him. Not the least bit embarrassed, Letty said in a joyful voice, out of the twinkle in her eye that she would think of a name for him then. After a little thought, the girl asked cheekily, how about the name Lime? He had bright green eyes, similar to the color of limes. He looked at her with a surprised look and didn't know what to say. He didn't know what he should call himself. In a disgruntled voice, he asked the girl what the hell she was talking about. Not frightened, she said it was a great name. It suits him just fine. She didn't seem at all embarrassed by the guy's displeasure. Smiling, she said that now they would know each other. He had already resigned himself to being called like a fruit. He just nodded back at her and tried to put a smile on his face. Well, he would be called Lime from now on. The two of them were standing at the entrance of the academy, when suddenly some strange sound came from nowhere, and the two of them looked up. Letty told her new acquaintance that they had to go quickly. It was obvious that she was worried about something. From the side, there were two guys looking at them. One of them was wearing a bright red cloak and a sword gleamed behind his belt. They were looking at Lime with disdain. While it was the next student's turn, it was Letty. The girl stood there, smiling in her usual way. Nothing seemed to embarrass her at all. Swinging around, she used her spell. A bright flash of green light and a powerful energy wave cut through space. The spell was really strong, and people began to look at each other in surprise and whisper amongst themselves. The rumors were true. The people's faces shone with genuine delight. After all, she is the princess of the Dark Elf tribe. When Lime heard that, he couldn't believe his eyes. This girl is a princess of the Dark Elves? How did that happen? Well, you shouldn't judge demons by their appearance. Even though this girl seemed outwardly carefree and even a little silly, she had her own skeletons in her closet. Lime wondered if he should change his attitude toward this girl. She didn't seem to be radiating any danger right now. Letty came up to him and looked at him with an important look. It was obvious that she was very pleased with her performance, and now she was ready to show off her skills to her new acquaintance. Lime said it was amazing. If she kept it up, she could easily pass the exam. The girl rejoiced at such praise. Did he really think so? Her face stretched in a wide smile. She said that she would try her best like that from now on. But their celebration was interrupted by someone. Heavy footsteps sounding nearby. It was the same guy who had originally squinted at him at the academy door. He said that the wretch would never pass the exam, praising the Dark Elf princess. What a wretched thing to say. An inhuman contempt could be heard in the guy's voice. It was the vampire Haig. Lime turned to him in surprise, but did not say a word. Letty also looked at him with an uncomprehending look. What did he want anyway? Haig said that he remembered that this guy was Butch's servant. What is he forgetting here? Did he really think he was capable of passing the entrance exam? He tried his best to crush Lime's morale, but the boy only sighed heavily, saying nothing. Letty was indignant. So what if he came to take the exam, so what? Lime turned to her and muttered to himself that he could fend for himself. No need to be his protector. The boy looked irritatedly at his new acquaintance. How does she even know? She hadn't even seen you once. Haig snorted angrily and said irritably that Lime would soon have a chance to prove himself. The princess of the Dark Elves puffed up her cheeks and glared angrily at the examining vampire. It was obvious that she was even more pissed off than Lime himself. This was truly a strange girl. While Letty was resentful, the protagonist was thinking, and why does he have to prove anything to anyone? Why does he even need to do that? He's got his own agenda, but still there was no way out. He sighed heavily and said he would do his best. Letty said in a serious tone that he should be more serious. She was rooting for him. Well, if he was more serious, he would just blow this square to smithereens. He tried his best not to show his true strength so as not to arouse any suspicion. Paying attention to bullies like this vampire was a waste of time. In the middle of the training ground stood a mannequin with a target. This thing was intended for training and practicing the accuracy and strength of blows, even though he wanted to test his strength to the max. But he thought he should hold back now, so as not to arouse the suspicion of those around him. The inspectors called the next contestant over to them, and Lime approached him with his arm out in front of him. The boy closed his eyes and began to gather all his power, concentrating it in his hand. He had to show his magic, but not to attract the attention of others. Well, let's go. Lime put his finger forward, and his hand began to glow with purple magic. A swift ray of purple magic energy burst out from his hand. It was so strong that everyone covered their ears to avoid going deaf. The instructor was frightened and dropped the clipboard from his hands. He didn't know what to say and began to stutter. The man was shaking with fear. What was that? Lime covered his face with his hands. It seemed he had overdone it, so now he had to explain himself. Haig lay on the ground, struck down by this spell. He looked fearfully in Lime's direction and didn't know what to say to him. The boy was amazed at such power. He didn't expect a mere goblin to have such skills. Letty was jumping up and down and didn't know how to calm you down. She was screaming that Lime was unbelievably cool. She didn't expect him to be so smart. The kid scratched the back of his head and embarrassedly said that he had given it his best, just like the princess had asked him to. Naturally, he lied. It wasn't his full strength. After the written test, they took a break. Letty was leaning against the wall, looking worried about something. Lime approached her from the side and asked what was wrong with her. He could see that the girl was troubled about something. The princess had said that tests had always been sheer torture for her, and they were just about to be introduced by the entrance exams. So that's what she was worried about. The girl turned to him and asked if Lime wasn't worried himself. The boy lowered his eyes and said he was a little worried. The tests were more difficult than just showing his magical abilities. Suddenly, the vampire Haig came up to them from the side. He looked at them contemptuously, as usual, and said that he didn't know what trick the boy had pulled to fool the examiners. But a lowlife like this goblin can't conjure like that. Lime calmly replied that the vampire apparently had a lot of free time to think about others, not himself. Is he so sure he passed the exam? Haig didn't know what to say to that, and just stared stupidly at the protagonist. How dare he treat him like that? The vampire grabbed his sword and was about to attack to defend his honor. Suddenly, a magical symbol appeared on the ceiling. A voice announced that the battle trials would begin very soon, so all participants should go to the central square. Letty turned around in surprise at the sound. Lime didn't seem to be expressing any emotion, just stood wrapped in his hood. Haig clenched his teeth in annoyance. This time they had been interrupted, but he would definitely get even for this offense next time. The vampire turned back to Lime. Out of the same contemptuous grin on his face, looked at him askew. Standing in front of them and in a booming voice said that the time of combat testing had begun. The man was dressed in a strict suit, and he had a clipboard in his hands. In a stern voice, he said that this time the exam was different from the previous one. If it was held in a one-on-one duel format before, now the students would fight in a group against a common enemy. A surprised shriek went up among the people. What's that supposed to mean? All against one? Should they fight in teams? Haig stood aside and looked irritably away. It was obvious that the guy was not satisfied with this arrangement. He wanted to demonstrate all his skills himself, not to mess around with someone. Letty listened attentively to the instruction and prepared herself for the difficulty. Lime, hiding his face under his hood, listened intently to every word. The examiner continued. He said that their headmaster had introduced a new policy for the entrance test. In his opinion, only the chosen ones would be able to withstand one formidable opponent. In his opinion, only a select few could stand up to one formidable opponent. The boys prepared for the challenge. The huge heavy bars of the gate began to creak upward, releasing the monster. As the students watched, grimaces of horror began to appear on their faces and their knees began to shake. This was something they were definitely not prepared for. From the black opening in the mouth, a horrible creature, more like a dragon, appeared. Its entire back was dotted with sharp spikes, and it had long claws on its huge, massive paws. Its mouth was full of white fangs. The guy stared in surprise at the eyes of this creature and prepared to repel the blow. He braced his whole body to be ready for anything. Fear flashed in his eyes for a second. This is their opponent? Are they really going to be able to handle this thing? The dragon! He appears near the end of the game as a boss. How can they make them fight such an opponent? The dragon clacked its teeth and lightning bolts began to burst out. Lime watched all this with wide eyes. His face was full of confusion and fear. The dragon conveniently roared and released a wave of magical energy from its huge, horrible mouth. If someone were to fall under this beam, they would immediately be incinerated. The students scattered in terror. None of them would definitely be able to deal with this monster one-on-one. It was necessary to save their lives. Frightened shouts and cries could be heard all around. A second later, everyone was already lying down, hit by the dragon beam. Haig looked at the creatures fearfully. He had never heard of a storm dragon being released during training. How are they supposed to deal with it? Letty stood in front of the dragon as if I didn't care about anything. The girl prepared to attack. She looked a little silly on the outside, but she had a lot of courage. After a second, the girl swiftly rushed towards the monster. It was as if nothing frightened her. Her eyes were focused on a single target. Lime called out fearfully to stop her. What is she doing? It's not like she can handle him alone. The girl didn't listen to him. She said she had to pass this exam at any cost. There was determination and fearlessness in her eyes. She had to do it all for the kingdom. The elfess used her spell, and magical chains entangled the dragon's horrible body in an instant. The girl tried her best to hold back the monster to deliver a crushing blow with the wind arrow. She had already drawn the bowstring of the magic bow, as the dragon suddenly released its spikes and broke the magic chains in an instant. And Save the Monster let out a deafening roar. But there was nowhere to retreat to. The girl pulled the bowstring even tighter and prepared to shoot. This was bad. If she didn't do something now, she was going to die. She clenched her eyes shut and prepared to accept her fate, but suddenly, nothing happened. She opened her eyes and saw the dragon being held back by the magical barrier that Lime had released. The monster couldn't get through to them. Holding back the monster, the guy asked the girl how she was feeling. Letty was dumbfounded. She was sitting on the ground, ready to accept death. But then she was suddenly rescued. Stammering, she replied that she was all right. Lime turned to the dragon and said calmly that he would deal with him quickly. Lime turned to the dragon and said calmly that he would deal with him quickly. She didn't realize what was going on. Was he going to deal with him quickly? How was that possible? Her eyes expressed complete incomprehension. The magical barrier began to act even stronger and pushed the dragon away. The boy let out a battle cry and prepared to fight the monster. Lime struck and the dragon fell back, but apparently did not take any significant damage. Suddenly the heavens opened, and from there a huge bolt of lightning shot straight at the dragon. Thus it was gaining strength for a future strike. Lime stood in front of it, restraining the creature with his energy barrier. The dragon was beginning to build up power, its skin glowing with electric shocks. This was bad. We had to get out of here as soon as possible or they were finished. The protagonist grabbed his girlfriend and jumped high up to dodge the dragon's attack. It was just in time. There was a deafening explosion below. This dragon couldn't be penetrated that easily. How much trouble would he be in? Letty was dumbfounded. Are they flying? The guy said they didn't have much time and she should wait downstairs. Letty didn't have time to say anything before the guy let her out of his arms. For a couple more seconds, the girl didn't realize anything. But she was already flying downward at high speed. Finally, when she realized it, she screamed in fear. But there was nothing to fear. Soon she flopped onto something soft and wet. Fortunately, the princess was not injured. What the hell is that? A huge blob of slime appeared right below her. It was the summoning of the goblin slime's heroic spirit. The smoke from the explosion cleared, revealing to the world the horrible monster that sought out its new victims. Lime looked down at him and prepared to deliver his crushing blow. It wasn't about stealth anymore. It was about survival at all costs. The main character's body began to sink into dark magic. It was an acceleration spell. In your eyes, it was time to show your true power. Lime rushed forward with great speed. It seemed his speed was so great that it was hard to even see the guy. The storm dragon spat fireballs at him, but the protagonist easily dodged them as if he was commanding time itself. The beast was perplexed as it watched its victim, who had suddenly gained such strength. The dragon was already preparing to spew out a new torrent of demonic flame. Lime flew close enough to him and kicked him in the face with great force. The dragon was knocked backwards by the force of the blow. There was a rumble in the distance. It seems the guy overdid it again and hit it too hard. At that time, all the other students were fleeing the battlefield in terror. Among them was the vampire Haig, who had so recently mocked the protagonist. But now he was running away like a coward. Even though the blow was strong, the dragon quickly recovered and prepared to attack again. Lime hovered in the air, enveloped in magical energy. He realized that he would need even more energy to defeat this dragon. The sky was filled with black clouds and lightning flashed through them. Great, this dragon had decided to summon thunderclouds just as Lime had expected. The guy appeared behind the back of the vampire, hiding behind the column. He didn't even have time to realize anything, but just watched the unfolding events. The protagonist quickly snatched the sword from the vampire, who didn't even have time to realize it, but just stood there, looking at the raging creature with a frightened look. Haig finally realized what had happened, but it was too late. The protagonist was approaching the dragon at the speed of light. Suddenly, a powerful lightning discharge appeared from the black thunder clouds, which immediately flew swiftly into the ground. The dragon looked around dazedly, trying to find its prey. Lime held the sword in his hand, charging it with his magical energy. There was only one chance. He had to kill this thing with one blow or it would blow the place apart. A gleam of determination flashed in the kid's eyes, and he used a darkness sword strike. His eyes burned with a violet magical color. The dragon didn't have time to think of anything, but suddenly all this great power came crashing down on him. The last thing he saw before he died was the sword of Lime. A second later, there was a deafening rumble, and shards of rock flew in different directions. The monster was defeated. A plaque with information immediately appeared in front of the guy. The reborn has completed the task awakening of the 3rd level. Received new black magic spells. Received a new item PM Jolner for killing a dragon. The examiner watched all this with amazement. He had never met such an unconventional individual before. He should have been reported to the principal immediately. Haig, together with his friend, pressed himself against the wall and watched it all with horror. He could not say a word, but just stared with frightened eyes. The elf princess looked at the protagonist with her eyes wide open in amazement and could not believe her eyes. She didn't understand how this guy had such power. Lime stood there as if nothing had happened. It looked like the combat test was over. The boy adjusted his hood and looked away. The academy was truly huge. Its courtyard contained several buildings, and the main building, which towered with its sharp spires into the sky. Lime and her friend were standing at the entrance. The elf was clenching her hands into fists, and it was obvious that she was very worried. Smiling, the girl said that she had no doubt that Lime would pass the exam. For some reason, she was enrolled too, even though she didn't mind. The guy turned to her and said in a calm voice that she was the one who first challenged the dragon after all. The girl grinned and, as if proud of herself, said, "If so, that makes sense." Lime asked, "So the girl's full name is Tiara Letitia Nilf?" The elfess smiled and said that was right, but it was too long, so let the guy just call her Letty. Suddenly, the girl twitched as if seeing something strange. Taking a quill, she began to write something. Lime watched her movements in surprise. The girl walked over to the nameplate with the names of the students and crossed out the word nameless individual, which was written opposite the race of the main character, and wrote the name Lime. Turning around, she smiled broadly. It would be like that now, since the guy already had a name. Lime smiled embarrassedly and squinted his eyes. He seemed to be embarrassed. Soon they came to a huge, spacious hall of white color. A man in a white uniform brought them a bundle of clothes. Soon they changed their clothes and looked like real students of the academy already. The elf princess was very happy. Apparently, the uniform was to her liking. A man in white robes approached them, holding out their robes and a book. He said that now these were their training robes and books. Lime took his robe and immediately threw it over himself, throwing his hood over himself out of habit. The man said they are in a dormitory. They have to pass a selection test to get a place in the dormitory before they can join. Another test? The guy was annoyed. What kind of rule is that? It was obvious that he was getting fed up with the whole thing. The man nodded and said in a cocky voice that it was exactly like that. In their academy, the dormitory was divided by the level of magic in the students' bodies. Soon he brought out some strange thing wrapped in a white sheet and tied with ropes. The students, standing on the balcony, watched the whole thing carefully. The boys also perplexedly began to stare. The instructor smiled wryly and said he wondered how they would pass the test. A young man with straight blonde hair stands at the group meeting, his gaze serious. "Did these two pass the combat test?" he asks, not hiding his doubt. The next shot shows two students standing slightly behind, with unperturbed faces. "I heard it was very tough this year." A whisper rumbles among the people present, emphasizing the tension of the moment. On the stage of the academy, where the fates of young warriors are decided in the blink of an eye, a young man with pale hair stands, glaring at two unsure recruits. Though at first glance you can't tell they're capable of anything, he doubts their strength, not believing that they are true fighters. In a hall where every whisper turns into an echo, a voice rang out, "Hey you." One of the recruits, Letty, raises her fist with inspiration and determination, preparing to prove her worth not only in words but also in deeds. Letty, determined to become a better warrior, hears her comrade's voice urging her to calm down. "Calm down. It's not that important right now," he says in an effort to ease the tension, seeing how ready she is to fight. Letty looked at Lime with intense scrutiny. "Lime, you're too kind to them." The words sounded cautionary, as if she knew something Lime didn't, and her concern was not only for him but for the common good. Lime, for his part, seemed lost in thought. "So, what's the point of this test?" he pondered aloud, as if trying to penetrate a veil of mystery that Letty might have already solved. Their dialogues, like threads intertwined in the weave of fate, foreshadowed the trials ahead in which Lime would learn not only secrets, but also lessons about his own goodness. The device the scientist was talking about seemed like something from the future. "It's very simple. Stand in front of the device. It will automatically analyze the amount of dark magic in your body," he explained, confident in every word. Lime only needed to touch his palm to the panel, and the results of their magical analysis would immediately appear on the screen. The enthusiastic scientist did not hide his pride in his creation. "This machine is the latest model. Just recently the Academy allocated money for it. We were so lucky to get it," he exclaimed like a child with a new toy. But his look immediately became puzzled as he added, "And that's why. It's simply impossible to fool this machine." Letty and Lime, standing side by side, exchanged glances. The test, which had seemed simple at first glance, was now a test not only of their abilities, but also of their honesty. "And so, first up will be Miss Letty, please," the scientist said, pointing to the instrument. Letty, though embarrassed, seemed determined. The adventure was just beginning, and it promised to be full of discovery. Letty approached the device. Her palm touched the cold glass, and immediately the room was filled with light. She eyed the device and the scientist, waiting for results, but her eyes read something more than curiosity. Maybe she feared an answer, or maybe she was waiting for it as confirmation of her hopes. The room suddenly became quiet, and a series of symbols appeared on the screen. Letty held her breath, trying to decipher their meaning. The scientist, who had been watching the process, suddenly turned pale, his lips quivering in surprise. "What the hell?" he burst from him. What the device showed was clearly beyond his expectations. Letty, equally surprised, waited for an explanation. At that moment, the story took a new, unexpected turn. The scientist, still stunned by Letty's results, tried to find a logical explanation. "She's a princess of a rare race of dark elves, right? That's probably why the system enrolled her in this dormitory," he pondered aloud. His words reflected an attempt to meld scientific knowledge with the myths and legends of the dark elves. Then his gaze shifted to Lime, who stood quietly, gathering his wits. "Next, Lime," the scientist said briefly, dismissing the doubt. Lime approached the machine, his hand resting on the panel. He seemed calm, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Though we'll measure your strength, I don't expect much from you. You're a goblin, after all," the scientist continued, but his words didn't seem offensive, more like he wanted to play a joke on Lime to relieve the tension. Lime only nodded, preparing to learn the truth about himself. "I've been checking my vitals for a while now," he replied, anticipating that the machine might produce results that would surprise not only the scientist, but the entire academy. As soon as Lime touched the device, a swirl of dark energy erupted around him. "I wonder how much stronger I've gotten." His voice was calm, but there was a sense of power in his words. The atmosphere in the room changed, becoming as if charged with this invisible power. The scientist looked at what was happening with wide eyes. What is it?" he blurted out as the symbols on the screen began to flicker and change, reflecting the power that Lime carried within him. The walls of the room shook with a power that not even the Academy's magical devices could contain. It was a moment of truth that would reveal Lime's true potential, and perhaps reveal secrets that even he himself did not suspect. The girl squeezed her eyes shut so that the shards from the shattered apparatus wouldn't hit her face. An unimaginable wind began to whip up around her. Lime stood stunned beside the destroyed machine, smoke billowing from it. The scientist wondered how such a thing was even possible. He had seen it for the first time in his life, and he couldn't believe it. "Fuck," Lime thought to himself. He'd overdone it this time too, and now how do I explain it? The scientist was furious. It was the newest machine. It cost 500 gold pieces. The scientist's grief was unquenchable. Lime just stood there, scratching the back of his head, looking into the eyes of the dazed scientist. He said that this machine had recently been purchased by the Academy, and it had worked perfectly well before this guy. What do we do with his test now? The kid just apologized in embarrassment. He didn't mean for this to happen. Now that made it harder. He had to explain the failure of the machine somehow. The scientist continued to get angry. As punishment, he would put the boy in the weakest of the dormitories. The man pointed his finger directly at the boy, who just stood there and flapped his eyes. Letty was horrified when she heard that. How could she? Now he would live with the weakest members. Lime stood there, unsure of what to do. Shit. If they put him in the worst dorm, he'd never meet the principal at this rate. A whisper fell among the students. Everyone was discussing what had happened. No one could believe that a freshman could break the newest machine, but he paid no attention to them. He now had to figure out some other way he could meet with the director. He lowered his gaze, trying not to show it. Soon night fell. The windows of the dormitories were darkened and all the students were getting ready to go to sleep, because tomorrow they were going to study hard. The boy sat on his bed, staring blankly at the notification screen. He hadn't even gotten undressed in time to get ready for bed. Too many unforeseen events had happened that day, and he'd need to think it over. And so his main goal at the moment was to become the best student of the Academy. His eyes lit up with excitement and confidence. Kill him and seize all territories belonging to King Dior. However, because of his own mistake, he was assigned to the lowest-ranked dormitory, and what to do now? His mind was swarming with thoughts. He had to come up with a plan to get out of this difficult situation. Maybe in the future he could transfer to Lucifer's dormitory with Letty, but he'd still have to try to pull that off. Suddenly something caught his attention, and the boy shifted his interested gaze to the side. On the table was a book that had recently been given to him by the scholar who had taken them into the dormitory. The boy took the small piece of paper. It was just what he needed. This was his chance. A happy smile stretched across the boy's face. He seemed to have found the right way. He stopped in front of a door with a sign that had obscure symbols on it. Well, there was no turning back. If he wanted to realize what he had planned, he would have to act decisively. A girl sat in front of him and asked with a surprised look, "Does he really want to apply for the magic tournament?" Lime nodded his head affirmatively and pulled the very same piece of paper out of his pocket, showing it to the girl. Academic tournament, it is quite a challenge. It requires indescribable concentration and strength from each participant. This tournament is held once a year to find the strongest mage among the students of the academy. This tournament is a centuries-old tradition of the academy, and anyone can participate in it. The winner will receive a magical treasure prepared by the founder of the academy, Dur. This prize is the highest value in the academy. Simply put, the prize itself will be presented personally by the principal. This is a chance to personally meet him face to face. The boy's eyes were burning with determination. He had to act here and now. He stood in front of the application window. The girl looked at him in surprise and said that he had entered the academy only 2 days ago. The guy nodded his head affirmatively. She said that a magic tournament is a pretty dangerous event. He understands that, doesn't he? Although anyone can participate, it's not recommended for freshmen to show up at the tournament. Annoyed, Lime said that he was aware of that and wanted to participate anyway. The girl sighed tiredly and asked him to wait a couple minutes, then withdrew in an unknown direction. The pen moved quickly over the piece of paper, tracing out the symbols one by one. There was a magic crystal on the table next to it, glowing blue. The girl said they had a strange freshman come in for an appointment. The man in glasses, sitting on a chair, said that he was the kid who broke the measuring instruments. The girl asked if she should refuse the application. The man's face stretched into a predatory smile. He shook his head negatively. No, she shouldn't. We should let him sign up for the tournament. The girl nodded. A few moments later, she reappeared in front of Lime. She slipped him an application slip and told him that he had been accepted into the tournament, but let him keep in mind that the organizers were not responsible for his safety at the tournament. The boy nodded this time too. He was aware of the danger he was taking. This was his one chance, which he was obliged to take. There was no other way. The boy's determined look spoke for itself. At this time, the elf princess was washing herself in her shower. She thought that she was very lucky to have met Lime after all. He had even saved her life. It was as if the prince had swept her up in his arms. The girl dreamily closed her eyes, and the events of recent days flashed through her imagination. But then she quickly came to her senses. After all, then this guy had ruthlessly thrown her away. What was she thinking about now? Soon she came out of the bathroom, sat on a chair and began brushing her lush hair. Her cheeks flushed. She thought she saw something majestic in his figure. A slight blush of embarrassment appeared on her cheeks. It was as if she couldn't take her eyes off him. It was as if she never wanted to leave him. Suddenly she twitched. The girl didn't understand why when she thought of this guy her heart was beating so hard. It was something strange. Night had already dominated the street, and all the students had long since settled into their beds to rest before tomorrow's tests. The kid was lying in his bed pretending to be sound asleep, or maybe he really was. Suddenly he heard a strange sound coming from outside. Lime opened his eyes and looked warily in that direction. He jumped to the roof of the building and landed deftly on the slippery tiles. The guy with a loud voice summoned the goblin priestess. After a second, a vortex of dark energy began to form around him, and the face of the priestess appeared. In a cocky voice, she said she was here, ready to do his bidding. The protagonist's face was serious, half hidden by a hood. Lime said he had a favor to ask of her. He'd need her abilities too. The boy hesitated as if searching for words. Suddenly he noticed that something was wrong. The goblin priestess was wearing an academy uniform. And why did she do that? It looked very ridiculous and strange. The Zadorn girl said that it was just a disguise, so that no one would reveal her. Lime sighed and said it wasn't necessary, but if she wanted to do it, let her do it. The boy said he needed to get married. The goblins explored the school using his ghostliness. She nodded with a smile and said she would do the master's bidding. Suddenly, a magical aura could be felt in the air. The boy pulled back his hood to get a better look at who had come to him. It was the same goblin fairy. She waved to him in a friendly manner and told him that she had delivered the girl to the village. Right now, she was in the care of Lime's little sister. Smiling, the boy thanked the fairy for her help. This girl really needed protection, so some more evil demon couldn't get a hold of her. The boy got busy and embarrassedly asked the fairy for one more favor. Even though she had just returned, could she and the priestess draw him a map of the academy? Mapu. The fairy was surprised at such a strange wording. The guy sighed and said it meant map. Draw a map of the academy's terrain. I sighed. Right away, he would have told her so. She could draw a mappa. He's here, right? The fairy's eyes took on a serious tone as if she was looking for someone. Lime wrapped himself even more tightly in his hood and nodded affirmatively. He said, heading straight for him. And there he was, mystified and anticipating. No one knew about his mysterious plan. The guy stood on the roof of the academy and looked thoughtfully at the main building, above which the white glowing disk of the moon was already rising. Well, their secret mission starts now. The guy's voice sounded more confident than ever. The first place they would head to was the tower of the headmaster of the Magic Academy. It was like a tall mountain above all the other buildings. The guy was racing across the rooftops like some kind of mercenary. He had to be as stealthy as possible, so as not to draw attention to himself. He moved as nimbly as if he had been doing it all his life. His footsteps could be heard twice in the silence of the night. He had to use shadow camouflage to avoid being seen by anyone. A purple blanket of magic enveloped his body. It helped only partially to conceal his presence. He stopped at the window and listened intently to the conversation inside. There was a light on outside the window. Someone must still be awake. There were several people sitting at a huge long table. Apparently, they were the highest ranks of the academy who managed everything that was going on here, and there was some important dialogue between them. At the head of the table sat a man with a long gray beard, dressed in a light blue robe. He was the headman of the Wesker Council. Also there, all business, is a woman dressed in a gorgeous purple dress. Her eyes were of cunning and guile. It was the head secretary of the Magic Tournament Management Office, Mylene. Beside them, there was a man with glasses and a serious expression. It was Eddie's teacher. There was another man in their company. He had bright red hair, and his head was crowned with 2 large horns. He was the student council president of the Dragon Lord Kaya. Eddie's teacher adjusted his glasses and said in a concerned, serious tone that he was dangerous. An extreme degree of concern and even fear could be heard in his voice. He said that anything could be expected from this freshman. He is completely unsuitable for their academy. His existence here violates every age-old tradition of their institution. The council headman said in a calm voice that he was the only one who could defeat the feed dragon in the entrance test, right? The head secretary confirmed. They didn't expect anyone to be able to defeat it. But they were very wrong. The head elder thought about it and realized that this guy was extremely strong for his age and level. Eddie's teacher wouldn't let it go. He irritatedly said that, moreover, this goblin kid, Eddie's teacher, didn't stop. He said that their school doesn't accept the strongest people. It accepts the noblest people. This student is just a goblin, a member of the lowest race. This is unthinkable. They can't allow him to study at their academy. How will they be able to look the headmaster in the eye after all this? The old man asked. And that was why they decided to let him participate in the tournament? The woman covered her face with a luxurious fan and nodded affirmatively. After all, students are warned in advance about the risks in the tournament. Death in these fights is nothing new. The old man fell silent. They have, as always, a cardinal solution to such minor problems. Eddie's teacher wouldn't stop. He indignantly said that, moreover, this kid is a goblin. How could they even let him take the exam? The woman replied that the head teacher allowed anyone to take the entrance exam. The teacher became furious. Was he the only one concerned about preserving their age-old traditions? The boy listened to all this attentively without making a sound. Everyone has the right to enter the academy. However, not everyone is happy to see a goblin here. It was strange. The elder was silent and listened to the 2 men squabble. He looked away as if noticing something there. In a serious voice, the old man said that since they had already decided everything, so be it. He would end the meeting for today. It was time for him to get ready for bed. Everyone got up from the table and started to leave. The secretary looked at him in surprise. Did he just approve of their actions? That didn't sound like their head man. Eddie's teacher appealed to the old age of the student council. He ordered him to adjust the competition table so that at the first battle, this freshman would face a representative of their race. Fury glittered in the teacher's eyes. These dragon men are the pride of their academy after all, so let them get rid of this misunderstanding. Kaya nodded obediently. He would fulfill his teacher's will. Fury glittered in his eyes, and a strange magical aura of incredible power suddenly formed around him. The main character was silently watching all of this. When he saw this dragon eater, he wondered, what kind of creature is this? Well, okay, he'd love to fight him. The boy wrapped himself even tighter in his cloak. The girl secretary covered her face with the fan even more. The aristocrat is channeling all his strength to get rid of some goblin, laughing. This situation really amused her. Eddie's teacher slapped his hands on the table and declared that this woman didn't understand anything. It was not only about his personal honor, but also about the honor of the whole academy. Our hero continued to watch everything going on from afar. He thought he wouldn't hear anything interesting anymore, so it was time to head back to his room. With a quick jump, he seemed to vaporize into thin air. The guy stood on the roof of the main building and watched the academy grounds. A goblin priestess was standing next to him. I found out. In the academy's library, she found a secret underground passage behind the bookcases. The goblin fairy said that she had, at that time, drawn a map of the academy as the master had asked. The boy gratefully took the piece of paper from her. He thanked his associates and said that was the end of it. They could go their separate ways. Suddenly, something caught his attention, and the guy turned around in the direction of the incomprehensible sound. The stranger held the handle of the ball tightly in his hands, the blade of which glittered in the darkness of the night. He was practicing hard, and was swinging his weapon in different directions while emitting battle cries. It was also one of the monsters, and it had 2 beast ears on its head. Amazing, practicing until deep into the night. Lime was starting to look up to this kid. The goblin fairy said he's been training here since she started mapping the academy. He is a member of the kobold race, after all. Seems to come from an inferior race and lives together with Lime in the same dormitory. The boy continued to train hard. It turned out that nothing existed for him but his sword, and the boundless desire to become the best of the best. Lime pulled his hood up even tighter, and thought that everyone had a hard time in this world in their own way. He had to go back to his room and rest now. In a few moments, he was already in his room and had removed his hood. There was no need to hide here. The boy turned to the goblin fairy. His face was troubled. Something seemed to be bothering him. Was going to bed, and not even though I asked what he wanted. The guy whimpered and asked what she was doing in his bed, and indeed, the little creature was sprawled out in the bed valiantly, as if that's what she needed to do. The girl asked irritably, "Isn't she cute? How could such a beautiful fairy sleep on a chair or on the floor?" You could hear the irritation in her voice. She offered him to sleep together. Hadn't he ever dreamed of sharing a bed with a beauty like her? He could hear the playfulness in her voice. The guy brushed it off. If he's stirring in his sleep, he could crush you after all, so let her fly out of here. The fairy looked at him in surprise, as if she was thinking of something. Suddenly, the room was covered with magic smoke. And in a second, a beautiful girl of normal human height took the place of the little fairy. She said, "What if I did?" The boy became even more embarrassed. He wasn't used to seeing a stranger in his bed. He said wearily that she should just let him sleep. I laughed and said she was just kidding. If the goddess found out, she'd be punished, and his sister would be jealous. The fairy took back her usual appearance and said she was going to sleep, wishing the guy a good night. She went to bed and covered herself with a blanket and fell asleep. The kid was awake before going to bed. He would need to summarize everything he had learned during the day. There was a lot of information, and his head was exploding. He unfolded the map of the academy in front of him and began to study it carefully. Tomorrow was a big day, so he had to be prepared so he wouldn't screw up. The dining hall was dominated by excitement. Everyone sat at their tables and devoured their food. The students had to gain strength before they could participate in the tournament. Lime was sitting at his desk, eating soup and bread. He looked away and began to watch someone. In the distance, he noticed his new friend, Letty. She was talking to her friends at the table, as if she didn't notice anyone. Suddenly, she shifted her gaze to the side and seemed to notice the guy. There was surprise in her gaze, mixed with joy. As soon as she saw Lime, she waved animatedly for him to notice her. A big, beaming smile immediately appeared on her face. It seemed that nothing could upset this girl at all, and her friends turned to look at her questioningly. As he thought, keeping in touch with the girl that lives in the most elite dormitory, not so easy if he himself actually lives there. The guy was embarrassed and waved at her rather discreetly. He stared at the invitation list for the magic tournament. It would start in 5 days. Well, one had to be well prepared. Suddenly, someone approached him from behind and an unfamiliar voice sounded. The stranger asked if he could sit down. Lime mumbled something to himself. It was the same kid who practiced last night. He smiled and thanked the Lime. The guy looked over at him and immediately recognized him. This is the same guy who practiced last night. He asked Lime, he's new to living at all, and Sarah, he's from there too. Lime said hello kindly. Now they would be familiar. Suddenly embarrassed, the boy said he had overheard something. His voice sounded like it was trembling. He asked Lime, was it true that he had applied for the magic tournament? The boy shifted his gaze to him and replied indifferently that it was true. His eyes suddenly lit up with happiness. He wanted to say that he was too, but didn't have time. 2 people he hadn't noticed came up behind him. Someone's heavy hand with great speed was descending straight toward the guy. One of these guys, in a very unfriendly way, put his arm around the guy and said in a gruff voice, "Who let him eat at the table?" Lime shifted his embittered gaze to him. The boy hesitated and stammered. He said that all students could eat in the cafeteria. The guy's face showed that he was really scared. His abuser's name was Nero. He asked in a rage who let the dog into the dining room. He should be eating in the garbage. The poor man lowered his gaze and said under his breath that he hadn't broken any rules. Nero asked angrily, "What's he yapping about?" You could hear in his voice that he had no intention of reconciling. Lime, apparently tired of enduring this, grabbed the offender's arm and ordered him to stop. The boy gave him an angry look. Nero gave him an angry look and asked dismissively, "Who the hell is that?" Lime said without fear that he was a goblin, so he couldn't eat lunch now that he was of a lower race. Hearing this, the bully looked at him with an unkind look. "So it's a rookie." His eyes changed, a predatory tone. He said he would explain to him brotherly, "What are the local rules?" He crunched his fingers. His associates already prepared to stand at attention. Now it looked like a fight was about to break out. Lime said he was all for it. And a magical aura suddenly began to form around him. Let them enlighten him. His new acquaintances watched the rapidly unfolding events with horror. What to do, after all? He had gotten into a fight because of him. There was the sound of impact, but Nero's accomplices watched in horror. They had not expected such a reversal. Lime pulled his hand away, and there was a red mark where he'd just been holding on. Nero fell to the floor, holding his bruised arm. The boy crouched down beside him and looked him straight in the eye. His eyes reflected coldness. He began to say in a calm voice, "Anyone can dine in this dining hall." It seemed that he was now ready to kill this bully. Nero squinted at him, holding his lambent hand. He did not rise. How could this be? One touch hurt so much. His friends started to talk him out of it. The boy tried to get up, but his strength was suspiciously low. The other guys said that this first year was rumored to have defeated the dragon in the entrance exam alone. Hearing this, the guy's eyes went wide with surprise. He struggled to get them up with a hum and ordered his underlings to leave immediately. Lime just stared at him in silence. Lastly, he pointed a finger at the guy and said that he had been spotted by the dragon men of the Flame Breath faction. The guy gritted his teeth in anger. He said he would be very curious. How would the newcomer handle them? The guy with the dog ears thanked Lime for saving him. He apologized he had to get into a fight because of him. Lime coldly replied that it was okay and he shouldn't take it personally. In fact, he said that he had also applied to participate in the magic tournament. He took up his sword. If his voice trembled, it was to everyone's nose, but still Each phrase came to him with great difficulty. The poor man sadly lowered his eyes to his sword. Such a weakling, he can't even fight back. His words were filled with despair. It was ridiculous to think that he could win at all. Lime just stared at him in silence and listened to every word. Suddenly he shouted that this guy's name is Buttercup. So his name is Arcadia Buttercup? The guy didn't know what to say, so he leaned back. Stammering, he said that yes, that's his name. Had he met him before? Lime told the man to keep his head down, simple. He didn't have time to finish the sentence. Arcadia Buttercup. In the future, this young man would handle a large army by himself. and will be the strongest swordsman on the continent. Among his enemies, he will be known as the Black Knight. At this time, the uncomprehending people just stared at him without saying a word. Eventually, they said goodbye. Buttercup already had to go, and he waved goodbye to his new friend. But Lime stopped him. Buttercup asked, "What's the matter?" The kid said he could train with him at night if he wanted. Buttercup didn't expect that and asked where he had seen him. You could hear the embarrassment and fear in his voice. Hearing this made the kid happy. He was all for it. Well, now they'll try together, then let them meet tonight. But Buttercup didn't have time to finish. Lime said in a serious voice to be honest with him. The boy didn't know what he was talking about and stared at his friend questioningly. Lime said that if he was not mistaken, and Buttercup's sister is a nun serving in a church in the territory of the god Chanel, one of the Great Seven. Buttercup was shocked. How did he know? Lime replied that he had heard various rumors. The boy told Buttercup to listen to him carefully. Soon his sister would go to a village bordering human territories for missionary work. When that happens, let Buttercup tell her to go home without looking back. Let him consider it a long return for the incident in the dining room. Let his sister be careful, said the boy with alarm in his voice. Lime gave himself the most serious look possible. He asked Buttercup if he had got it right. The man only looked at him fearfully and replied in a stammering voice that he understood and would do everything. Lime smiled again, assuming his usual friendly look, and waved and said they'd see each other soon. He was about to go about his business when the fairy swept past him. She asked indignantly, "Is he up to something again?" The guy evasively replied that maybe he was. To himself, he thought that the information he had just said should change Buttercup's life. His plan is to wake him up while keeping his sister alive. The guy stood in front of the coffin where his sister was lying. A few days later, midnight, behind the academy, the guys, as promised to each other, started practicing with each other. Sword strokes cut through space. Buttercup looked forward joyfully. He had done it. The boy's eyes were filled with unconcealed delight. He was able to make such a cut with an ordinary sword. Lime turned to him. He said that the guy had been practicing every night after all, so such a result was quite expected. Buttercup couldn't believe his eyes. He denied everything. It was all thanks to the advice of his new friend. He didn't know that his strikes could be improved simply by enchanting his sword. Lime smiled and thanked his friend for his kind words. Buttercup looked at his sword, his face reflected in the blade, and a worried look on his face. Tomorrow was the first day of the tournament. He had to prepare. Buttercup annoyedly said that he thought this was their last training session. He held his sword in his hands and gently wiped it with a cloth. In such a short period of time, he had achieved a great result. He didn't give up and continued to stand his ground despite the fact that everyone thought he was weak. His true strength was determination. Buttercup listened to all this with his eyes wide open. Lime went on. Besides, he said, practicing with him every night, he realized something. His voice became determined. The kid looked at Lime with incomprehension. What other true abilities? Lime began to say usually latent abilities like Buttercup's powers are unlocked by a strong emotional shakeup. And frankly, he wished he could avoid that for Buttercup. Lime looked at him carefully. The boy continued, because if Buttercup experienced something like this, he would gain strength, but he would lose his mind completely. The boy listened to these speeches fearfully and did not know what to say. In the end, Lime sighed heavily and told Buttercup not to take it personally. It was just him thinking out loud. The guy then asked his friend to close his eyes for a second. Buttercup obediently complied with the request. Buttercup at this moment instantly applied the dark magic of shadow analysis. His eyes lit up with dark magic and he began to scrutinize Buttercup's internal state. It happened just as he thought it would. All of this man's dark magic is in a sealed state. It's like these iron chains are keeping a rabid beast under control. Lime realized that Buttercup had been growing with similar restrictions all his life. It was affecting his internal and external state, and something had to be done about it. He ordered Buttercup not to move. Suddenly, the guy felt as if magical energy was passing through his body. He couldn't move a finger, but he felt that something was wrong. After a second, it was over. Lime put a friendly hand on Buttercup's shoulder and said that was the end of it. The boy looked at him perplexed. Putting on his hood, the protagonist began to walk away in the opposite direction. Buttercup crouched perplexed on a rock. What had just happened? It was as if he had just been stabbed with spears. In parting, Lime tossed over his shoulder that their training was over for the day. Tomorrow would be a hard day. They needed to get ready. The boy nodded and said it was time to go. But still he looked at his new friend perplexed, even fearful. Morning came, the events moved to the great Colosseum, where the magical competition was to take place. The Colosseum was full of people screaming in anticipation of the magnificent spectacle, each of them cheering for their team. In the center of the Colosseum, the competitors appeared. Lime was among them. He was scrutinizing the people present and assessing his chances. His face was completely concentrated now. It was necessary to gather all his forces together to win by all means. Also, Buttercup was standing there as well. He looked around fearfully. It was the first time he had been in this position. There were too many people around and it was weighing on him. The dragonmen were coming out from the opposite side. Kaya was leading them. His face was full of determination, and his eyes glittered with anger and a desire for victory. Suddenly, a woman appeared from backstage. It was the secretary. In a loud voice, she began to speak. Everyone had been waiting for a long time, and now the day had come. The start of their all-time favorite magic tournament. This event has been held by their academy since its founding, and it has left no one indifferent. The crowd buzzed in anticipation of the spectacle. The woman continued. She said that the start of the event would be announced by their founder and everyone's favorite director, Mr. Dior. She sends him a word of welcome. Lime was wary. Determination gleamed in his eyes. Here it was, the moment was true, now he would see this supreme demon. Magical energy began to spread everywhere, and the guy naturally felt it. Is this magic like goblin kinship? No. The connection seems to be coming from somewhere else. It's just a hologram. Soon an image of the headmaster himself appeared. In a thunderous voice, he said that everyone present was their future strength of the Royal Demon Army. His every word had a firmness to it. All the people present shouted enthusiastically. They put their fists upwards, saluting the academy principal. Letty lowered her eyes and concentrated, waiting her turn. Okay, thought the hidden goblin village suffering from the tyranny of this demon's manifestation. He would definitely win the tournament and kill that arrogant bastard. That was his main goal. The reason why he actually joined this academy. The kid was scrutinizing the sheet with the participants. He was trying to find out who would be his first opponent. Behind the glass, a mysterious world is hidden, and each bubble is like a small universe. The text dancing in the whirlpool of liquid is reminiscent of ancient runes. The character's gaze is focused and determined. He is on the threshold of a great discovery. The students at the School of Magic scream in surprise. Something unexpected and shocking happens off-screen, causing them to cry out for help. Lime finds himself the victim of a magical prank. He looks dumbfounded, as if one of his companions has done something surprising and incomprehensible. Letty, with 2 magical drinks in hand, is clearly behind this hilarious incident. Her cheerful question confirms that it was all just a good-natured prank. Letty and Lime were discussing the latest news of the academy in the shade of an ancient maple tree. "Geez, I just came to cheer you up," Letty exclaimed as a murmur erupted next to her. She felt her cheeks blush with embarrassment. Lime, her inseparable companion, only shook his head. "I understand, but why did you have to blush so much?" he asked with a slight rebuke. Her friend couldn't help but laugh, replying, "Come on, like I've committed some kind of crime." She waved her hand in the air as if trying to dispel the tension that had built up. Lime sighed, but there was a spark of interest in his eyes. "Speaking of which, aren't first years banned from the tournament?" he asked, turning to Letty. The girl looked up at him, her eyes sparkling with confidence. "No, the rules don't say that," she replied, already envisioning her name gracing the winner's board. Lime leaned over to Letty, squinting enigmatically. "Why are you wondering?" he asked, as if hinting at the girl's hidden intentions. "First years aren't welcome here, but no one's forbidding them from participating," he mumbled slowly, holding Letty's gaze on his own. Letty, for her part, merely shrugged and smiled slyly. "It's just," she replied, letting the words hang in the air. The secrets of her participation in the tournament were hidden behind those 2 words, and she knew that Lime was feeling a real challenge. Letty, with a smile in her eyes, jokingly remarked, "No, it's all right." She was surprised at how determined Lime was. "You just entered and immediately enrolled in the tournament." Her words overflowed with respect for his courage. Letty tucked a strand of golden hair behind her ear and said, "It's just that you seemed much calmer and more reserved to me. And you surprised me by doing that, that's all. Her voice sounded playful, enjoying Lime's slight confusion at her unpredictable decision. Sitting in the shade of the trees, Lime looked at Letty with a slight smile. No, it's okay, he said, closing his eyes in pleasure. His relaxation was infectious. If Letty knew why I was in this, she'd tell me off immediately. He continued, alluding to their bond of friendship where each of them strove to support the other despite all the pranks and antics. Letty, though trying to keep a serious face, couldn't hide a smile. Geez, because you're asking yourself too much, Gadonja, she replied, knowing Lime was just being modest. Oh, right. It suddenly dawned on her, and there was not only playfulness in her voice, but admiration for Lime's eagerness to prove himself. The story of their friendship and rivalry promised to be an interesting one. Lime was handed a small, neatly tied pouch. Its weight in the palm of his hand was almost weightless, but its significance was great. Lime, sitting in front of Letty, held in his palm a small bag tied with a red ribbon. There was genuine curiosity in his gaze. What can this be? He seemed to be asking not only her, but himself as well. He gazed into it, genuinely surprised. What could be in there? He thought, weighing all the possibilities in his head. And suddenly, with a slight wave of his hand, Lime opened the pouch and something that looked like a clot of stars, tiny, glittering orbs, appeared in his palm. Is it really? He blurted out, his eyes glowing with wonder and admiration at the treasure that lurked within. Letty, with her eyes closed and a sweet smile, was munching on chocolate. Lime remembered everything. Did she want to give the dog away? The girl perplexedly ran her fingers over his fingers as if he'd just used them for a trick. It's just, thanks to your chocolate back then at the introductions, I was able to give my best. Well, I guess so, Letty explained. Yes, but don't misunderstand me, Letty exclaimed, a little embarrassed and at the same time concerned about how her words might be interpreted. It's just a way of apologizing for what happened. Nothing more. So don't take this chocolate seriously. No, you've got it wrong. Letty tried to correct the situation, her face expressing utter bewilderment. God, what am I talking about? Purred Letty, covering her face with her hands, overwhelmed with emotion from this misunderstanding. Lime, with slight bewilderment, replies to Letty, I don't know what you mean, but thank you. His words are full of sincerity despite his slight embarrassment at her gratitude. First time someone other than my sister has shown me such kindness. He continues as if opening his heart. The surprise in his eyes is replaced by warmth. Letty, on the other hand, though trying to maintain her seriousness, suddenly exclaims, D fool. Her reaction is full of emotion. She clearly did not expect such a reaction from Lime. And then, as luck would have it, the clock on the tower announces the start of something important. Oh, the start of the tournament is just around the corner, Letty says, her voice filled with excitement for the challenge ahead. Letty shouts out enthusiastically, You've already done it, Lime. Her face glows with confidence and support. She has complete faith in her friend's abilities. They clash fists in a show of camaraderie and mutual respect, ready for the challenge ahead. But the next moment, Lime, with his hand raised in a parting gesture, walks away, leaving Letty bewildered. Apparently, it was time to act and prove her fortitude in practice. Letty looks under her fingernail with genuine embarrassment and says, What the hell is going on with me? Her excitement of embarrassment is out of the ordinary. The arena erupts in applause. Lime stands out among the freshmen by defeating a thunder dragon, and the audience pays tribute to him by loudly applauding his courage and strength. Lime, standing in front of the arena, ready for a new challenge, feeling the support of everyone present. In this moment, he is not just a student. He is a hero who has taken the first step towards his legend. The guy's opponent was the Dragon Lord from the Lucifer dormitory, Orphan Escudo. The guy's face was full of confidence. He was a member of the Flame Breath faction and their right-hand man. The girls clearly welcomed this handsome man. He was clearly their favorite. The guy reciprocated them. He said that these girls were as beautiful as ever. The secretary sat in her seat together and asked Eddie's teacher if it was too suspicious to put Basil from the Dragonlance faction in the first fight of a newcomer's second fight. Eddie replied that they were doing serious business here, not playing games. The elder sat in his main seat and silently watched the scene, stroking his malleable beard. The herald asked Lime if he should be provided with a weapon. The lad shook his head in the negative and said it was not necessary. Orphan smiled widely. It looked like this fight was going to be fun for him, but for his opponent it would be over very quickly. The referee waved his hand and ordered the fight to begin. Now the fate of one of the contestants would be decided. Orphan was confident in his strength. He would finish him off in an instant. Dragon Master skill, Wyvern mode. The guy used his strongest spell and air on magic wings, preparing to deliver a crushing blow. The girls sat on the stands with their mouths open in amazement and looked at the handsome man with amorous gazes. He soared straight up into the sky. He's going to smash that goblin to the ground. The guy's body began to be covered in dark magic, and he used his magic covering spell. A jet of red flame began to fly quickly towards the Lime. The guy who took the form of a dragon flew at his opponent at a great speed. This newbie is going to be the end of him. I just watched silently, thinking that this was all a bit too easy for a dragon lord. Suddenly, the earth beneath the kid's feet began to crack. He hardly heard it. After a second, thick chains began to burst out from underneath the ground. They quickly entangled the kid's legs, preventing him from moving. This was his stealth attack. Lime turned back in surprise. The chains had already completely entangled his body, and now he couldn't move at all. The Elf Queen looked at all this with incomprehension. She began to worry about her comrade. At this time, the dragon finally accelerated and flew straight at the boy. Did he really think the dragon would fight fair? In a moment, it would catch up with its prey and tear him to shreds. A magical blade was formed in his hands, blazing with red flames. Lime just stood there, unable to move, and watched his opponent approaching him. For a second, fear flashed in his eyes. He had to act decisively, or he would be finished now. The stands were cheering. Now their favorite would defeat the pathetic goblin. The girl was gleaming with happiness, watching her favorite. Letty watched in horror as her comrade was about to be sprawled on the ground. She cried out, but there was nothing she could do. But it was all right. Lime quickly freed himself from the shackles and put out his sword to block a powerful attack. It was the summoning of the shadow sword, Mjolnir. Escudo didn't understand what was wrong. How was this newcomer able to block his attack? But he didn't have time to complete his thought as he fell to the ground with a clatter. Lime soared through the air, ready to deliver a sharp, crushing blow. His opponent had no time to realize it before the heavy hand and the ball came down on his neck. The blow was so strong that it pounded the guy into the ground, shards of rock flying in various directions. Lime said in a calm voice that it seemed his opponent couldn't get up anymore, so the fight was over. This seemed to be a regular thing for the guy. The judge announced the winner in a trembling voice. From the excitement, no one expected this turn of events, but it didn't make the sight any less beautiful. The teacher and secretary sitting on the bleachers were shocked. How was this even possible? They could not find words to describe their amazement. The elder silently watched all of this. He realized that this guy's stock of dark magic was equal to the SSS rank. Even an old man like him found it hard to hide his surprise. At this time, Letty was jumping with happiness. She was thrilled that her friend had defeated such a strong opponent. Lime walked calmly down the corridor, as if this battle had made no impression on him. And so his first battle was over. Suddenly he heard something strange to the side. It was his sister Lilia, and with her the very girl he had recently rescued from the demon's hands. A fairy flew up to him and said that these two wanted to see him fight. They said they had a duty to support their brother. Lily was amazed. She said that her brother had done a really cool job on that guy. The girl he had just saved said in a shaky voice that he was unbelievable. Lime walked over to them and stroked both of them on the head. With warmth in his voice, he said he was glad they liked it. The girl with green hair timidly held out a small bundle to him. She didn't know what to say, so she just stuttered. The girls had worked so hard for this. Lime began to unwrap the package, curious to see what was inside. And inside was a flavorful pie that the girls had baked especially for him. It was incredibly sweet and touching. The guy looked at the girl and asked, "Her name is Miyu, right?" She looked at him warily, and my cheeks flushed a little. He smiled warmly and thanked the girls for such a beautiful gift. He was very pleased that these two had come to support him at such an important moment. Miyu told the guy to try his best in the next round, properly clenched his hands into fists, and enthusiastically said that they would cheer for him because of all their strength. The guy came to his little room to get some rest and prepare for his next fight. Now round 2 is about to begin. Suddenly he heard some strange sound like a door opening. The boy quickly shifted his gaze in that direction. An unfamiliar girl burst into the room and cried out anxiously that there was trouble. His companion seemed to be badly hurt. He felt a chill inside him. Something had happened to his sister. He quickly ran out of the room, trying to save his family. Lime ran outside, trying to find his friends and family. They had to be here somewhere. He frantically shook his head in different directions. I'm trying to find someone, but the street was empty. Suddenly, there was some figure behind his back that was exuding strong magical energy. The guy still tried to find his friends, but he paid attention to the sudden opponent too late. His legs were suddenly entangled with spiky plants. Now he could not move. Lime lowered his head. He just walked into a trap, and a pretty cheap one at that. They'd used his relationship with his little sister to lure him here. How despicable. A blindfolded woman was holding some sort of magical crystal in the air, and chuckled quietly. It was the same girl from the Draconid clan. However, it wasn't that simple. These plants didn't seem to pose any danger to him. Indeed, with his strength, in one move, the guy broke the shackles. The girl had already realized that, but she had a trump card up her sleeve. She wouldn't be the guy's opponent. The rest of the clan began to converge from different directions, ready to rush at the guy in a minute. He found himself surrounded by enemies on all sides. At the head of them was the headman. He said that the tournament could wait, but right now he would fight against the entire Draconid order. His eyes burned with determination and bloodlust. "We'll finger the main character," he screamed for the pathetic goblins to prepare for his death. Lime looked at him blankly. He was not afraid of anything at all, and in principle these people posed no danger to him. The girl who had originally bound his legs with magic plants mockingly asked, was he at a loss for words from fear? Lime remained silent. He was calculating in his mind the time left before the tournament started. Only 3 minutes left. He mumbled it to himself. The clan chief asked angrily what he was muttering about. Lime repeated that there were 3 minutes left before the next battle started, so they better get it over with quickly. The Draconid's eyes lit up with fire. He was furious at being treated like this. Lime cast his spell to end it all quickly, for he was getting tired of these games. But from behind, another Draconid jumped at him, preparing to deliver a crushing blow to his back. The guy drew his sword and blocked a powerful blow. In his hand, a bright purple-colored spell appeared. It was dark magic, hellfire. He released the spell straight at his opponent. But the Draconids weren't slumbering either. They used a simultaneous attack that the guy couldn't dodge. A huge fireball flew straight at Lime. The opponents were already celebrating their victory, but it was too early to rejoice. There was delight on their faces, mixed with surprise. But then something happened that neither of them expected. Lime dodged all the attacks and in a second was already behind the backs of his attackers. With a single swing of his sword, he struck several people at once, releasing one powerful wave of dark magic energy. They didn't even have time to react as the purple magic pierced through them. One of them flew into a tree with tremendous force and hit it, rendering him unconscious. His eyes watered. He couldn't even move after such a powerful, crushing blow. The clan headman became furious and had already taken on full dragon form, expounding flames in different directions. How dare this little guy stand up to them? The huge dragon opened its fierce eyes. Around him, flames were streaming in different directions, ready to destroy all living things in its path. The dragon lunged forward with the clear goal of incinerating that little annoying goblin in one fell swoop. The dragon roared, its roar echoing for miles around. But Lime was ready for that too. He concentrated all his dark magic in one hand and prepared to deliver a crushing blow with his enhanced fist. A moment passed as his hand studied under the jaw of the huge dragon, delivering a blow. The dragon, unable to react in time, received a powerful blow. His head was thrown high up. Without wasting a second, the boy prepared to deliver a final blow to the enemy's torso. He'd already tried it on and concentrated all the power he had. Many sparks of magic flew in different directions. A split second later, Lime's fist made contact with the dragon's torso, imprinting it deeper and deeper. It all worked out as the guy planned. His opponents didn't even have time to realize anything. The dragon roared in pain, but it was all over for him. The long tail of the dragon flashed in the air, and then the monster fell to the ground with a thunderous crash, with thick puffs of dust spreading out in different directions. Draconid had been defeated. He had taken his human form and now lay exhausted on the earth. He was breathing heavily, unable to move a finger. So now it was over. But then Lime jerked himself back as if remembering something. There was another enemy lurking in the back of the building. How could he have forgotten about him? The girl was shaking with fear and tried to hide from the guy behind a stone pillar, but it was all in vain. Lime approached her, and the girl bowed her head as if recognizing his superiority over her. She was silent, afraid to utter a word, for this man could kill her in an instant. Lime calmly asked her how much time was left before the second round started. The girl didn't understand the questions at first, and only looked at him in surprise. But then she realized, and pulled out a stopwatch and said in a trembling voice that there were 2 minutes and 30 seconds to go. Her hands were shaking with fear. Lime said cheerfully, "That was great. He would make it to the arena in time." The girl looked back at him with fear. She didn't understand how this guy was able to handle them all in such a short time. Lime didn't even turn around, and walked in the opposite direction. She was left sitting alone, dumbfounded, trying to understand what had just happened. But in her heart, she was glad to be alive. The second round of the academic tournament had arrived. The next contestant was Lime, and his opponent was Draconid. But it looks like his opponent is late for the competition. If he didn't show up now, his absence would be counted as a technical defeat. He still didn't show up, and the judge announced in a trembling voice that the winner of this round was Lime. The boy scratched the back of his head and thought, which of those draconians was he supposed to fight? Lily and Miyu were sitting on the bleachers. I was watching everything with dumbfounded looks. Did the fight really end so quickly? How could it be? Eddie's teacher couldn't find a place to sit. How did this happen? What had happened? The elder smiled and laughed and said that this boy was lucky. The old man had a look of unconcealed joy on his face. Letty clenched her fists in excitement. Great. Good luck on their side. It was obvious from the girl's face that she was very worried about her comrade. Lily was happy too. They clapped their hands together with their friend. The girl didn't understand how come baby brother won. The judge reached out to the guy and announced that the winner was once again a Lime. Eddie's teacher had already lost all hope. He just sat in his chair, holding his head. His plan didn't seem to be working. Suddenly he saw a familiar face. His lips pursed, uttering the phrase, "Did he come after all?" A joyful smile stretched across his face. Well, it had been quite a while since they'd seen each other. Lime stood looking at his future opponent. Before him stood his old acquaintance, Arcadia Buttercup. Not a trace of the indecisive boy he had known. Now before him stood a brave warrior who was ready to accept any challenge of fate. Lime's eyes glowed with dark magical energy. He began to speak. In a grateful voice, he said that thanks to Lime, he was able to become stronger, and he was happy to meet him in the finals. He smiled. It seemed his plan had worked, and Buttercup's sister wasn't dead after all. He smiled and said that he too was glad to see his friend in his opponent's place. While the final battle was about to begin, Buttercup drew his sword, ready to attack. Something happened that no one expected. People wanted to say so much about it before, but there was no chance. Suddenly, the guy dropped the sword from his hands and raised them up. He said he was giving up. Everyone was shocked. Despite everyone's bewilderment, Buttercup began to speak. He said that he was really grateful for everything Lime had done for him. Therefore, he wanted to thank him for everything, and decided that in the final battle, he would give him the victory. It seems the protagonist didn't share his enthusiasm. He said in a disgruntled voice that it wasn't fair. He was looking forward to finally fighting him in the finals. If he's grateful to him, then let him fight him in a fair fight. Buttercup asked him in a defiant tone, "Is he sure about this?" The boy drew his sword, which suddenly began to exude incredible power. His face transformed, and if that was the case, he wouldn't hold back. The guy's eyes lit up with excitement. Well, that's great. Lime was excited to see what people had accomplished in such a short time. Well, the fight has begun. Buttercup rushed straight at his opponent with a determined look. This is going to be a magnificent fight. Lime was prepared for his comrade to not hold back in this fight. His eyes blazed with determination, and a battle cry came out of his mouth. They clashed in a fierce fight. The entire stage began to shake from the powerful blows of their opponents. Stone shards and dust flew in different directions. This was the first time something like this had happened in the history of the Academy. Their swords clashed, metal clashing, and the battle grew more and more intense. Dust and stones swirled around them. Each of their rivals was doing his best to win in a fair fight. As expected, he had no equal in swordsmanship. Lime understood that because people had been training hard all this time, and now he had become a true swordsman, the best of the best. Buttercup bounced to the side, dodging the blow, and cut through the clouds of dust with his sword. He gripped the hilt of his sword, preparing to deliver another swift and accurate strike. He had honed his swordsmanship to its limits, and now he was unrivaled in that skill. All of this was thanks to the magic of the Dark Knight. The bearer of this title gains tremendous physical abilities, but he still hasn't reached his full potential. Magical defense to dodge and defend against Buttercup's attacks. Their swords were once again in a furious battle. It seemed like they were dancing some kind of frenzied mad dance. It was a breathtaking sight. Their swords flashed through the air like bows and musical instruments. The protagonist's sister, along with her friend, watched it all from the stand. Her eyes widened. She realized that this guy was stronger than anyone who had fought her brother before. Letty looked at it all with a dazed and admiring gaze. This was all turning out to be incredibly cool to her. It was the first time she had ever seen such a stunningly beautiful fight. Her eyes widened with amazement. Teacher Eddie stood up from his podium. He didn't care who this guy was, just let him finish this goblin off finally. The swords were flying in the air with such speed that it was hard to follow them with the normal human gaze. Both opponents were at the limit of their abilities. It was truly a historic duel. Lime skillfully repelled all of his opponent's attacks with his magic sword. But suddenly the guy stumbled on a small pebble that was in the arena. His body fell sideways, and now he couldn't stay on his feet. The guy was falling sideways, and Buttercup couldn't pass up an opportunity like that for a win. Now his opponent caught. The lad rushed towards him, thrusting his sword forward to deliver the final blow. Liam barely had time to dodge from the glowing sword blade that passed from his throat only a few centimeters away. It went sideways, and Buttercup flew forward before he could stay on his feet. It was a clever ruse. Now Lime took the initiative and swung his dark sword to deliver a crushing blow, called the best swordsman. At the last moment, he dodged that deadly attack. The guy bounced to the side, breathing heavily. He barely had time to slow down. His boots were tearing out from underneath him. Buttercup looked at his opponent with a gaze full of determination to win. This man was not so easy to break. Lime watched his every move intently. Was he able to fend off his blow and not even get hurt? Buttercup stood shrouded in the dust of battle. His heart was beating at a doubled rate. It was getting more and more interesting. Lime prepared to strike again. He stood firmly on his feet, clutching the cold hilt of his sword in his hand. Buttercup looked at his weapon. The blade had simply broken into 2 pieces from such a hard blow. His clothes were also torn. We crossed their gazes, Lime looking at him with a calm but determined gaze. Such battles are a real chance for him to test his abilities. The guy realized that his opponent was left unarmed and hid his magic sword as well. Buttercup looked at him in surprise. What was he up to? Why had he hidden his sword? Lime understood that the Dark Knight's magic was tied to shadow illusions. Still, he wanted to fight him as an equal. It wouldn't be fair if one of them didn't have a weapon. That's it. No illusions and no deception. Lime looked defiantly at his opponent, determination in his eyes. He looked at him with the same determination, a smile gleaming on his face. The battle had energized him, and now nothing could stop the two of them. Lime wanted to explain himself. Let Buttercup not misunderstand him. He's not going to use dark magic against him. He just wants to fight him face to face. Honestly, without any tricks or deceit. Buttercup smiled broadly, beastly fangs gleaming in his mouth. Well, let him try. Light magical energy swirled around him, filling his body with power with each passing second. Their gazes crossed again. It was a real friendly duel. They looked at each other no longer as friends, but as rivals fighting for some very important title. After adopting a fighting stance, the guys began approaching each other at an unthinkable speed to deliver the final blow. It was weird. Let them fight seriously, but for some reason people were having so much fun. He was sure Lime wanted to win, but he so didn't want it to be over. He enjoyed the process itself. With each punch, he could feel himself getting stronger and stronger. It was just incredible. The guys were already standing a few meters away from each other, and they could almost physically feel the incredible energy that was emanating from them. It was only seconds before they would clash. And then the 2 energy bombs collided with each other, and there was an explosion so strong that everyone's ears popped. Lime bounced to the side, barely slowing down in time. The ground around him crackled from the battle. The kid looked at his opponent in surprise. Something was wrong. It was as if something had changed in him, something incomprehensible but tangible nonetheless. Buttercup had indeed changed. He had transformed even more, and now his body was enveloped by a vortex of light magical energy. Did he really pump up his level while fighting with him? It was simply astonishing. Suddenly, Lime realized this was bad. He could lose this way. The guy shouted for Buttercup to attack more boldly. After accumulating all his magical energy in his body, he lunged at him like a beast. But suddenly, Lime realized he'd missed his shot. Could Buttercup have dodged with such speed? Buttercup stood in the dust cloud, but at the same time did not lose his vigilance. He watched every movement of his opponent. The protagonist turned around and looked at him with undisguised curiosity, and even a touch of fear. He didn't expect his opponent to be so strong. Buttercup swung his leg to deliver a crushing blow, and Lime barely had time to dodge such a crushing blow. Another second and he would have been frozen. The kid couldn't believe his eyes. Surely he wasn't imagining things. What he was seeing was beyond what he had imagined. Did Buttercup really unleash this ability so soon? Well, we'll have to try something else now. The boy has resumed his fighting stance. To defeat him, he would have to use all of his power. The guy clenched his fists, and a veil of dark magical energy formed around him, filling his body with every second. He swung around and hit his opponent with his fist with all his might, but the latter managed to put up a block. The Buttercup grasped his hand and smiled predatorily. At that moment, he looked like a beast that had finally caught its long-awaited prey. Buttercup had a firm grip on his opponent's arm and kicked him in the stomach with all his might, but Lime was ready for that too. He concentrated all his magic power to dodge. Buttercup didn't understand what was going on. Had he disappeared? Was it really just an illusion? Lime found himself behind his opponent in a split second. He didn't even have time to realize anything, but just looked at him with a frightened and surprised look. Buttercup had time to feel someone's presence, but he was unable to do anything. The speed was too great. In a split second, there was a tremendous blow to his back. Buttercup couldn't stay on his feet and flew off into the wall with great speed, driving the stone even deeper inside. The impact took his breath away, and all his internal organs felt like they were stuck to his back. He tried to keep himself from losing consciousness, but it cost him a great deal of effort. Ludi let his eyes skip and finally came to his senses. He was already out of his beast state, and now his body was slowly leaving his strength. He had hardly passed into himself, and the first thing he saw was the face of Lime, who looked straight into his eyes with a confident look. But suddenly his comrade's gaze softened, and in an affectionate voice he said Buttercup became much stronger. At that moment, the strength had already completely left the guy's body, and he fell to the ground with a thud, closing his eyes. At this point, the last battle of this tournament was over. The winner was determined. But the man at this moment had received a far more valuable reward than a simple victory. He gained true power. Eddie's teacher jumped up from his chair, his teeth bared as he watched. He was angry. His plan had failed, and the goblin had won the tournament. Lime thanked everyone present for their attention in a calm voice. He had a calm smile on his face, and his eyes were confident. The elder proudly handed him the winner's trophy. He said that this trophy was rightfully his. The elder looked at the boy with an attentive gaze and seemed to be studying every inch of his body. He was interested in this boy primarily because of his incredible strength. But finally, the Lime plan was almost realized. He nodded calmly and said he understood. Suddenly, the old man stopped him with his booming voice. The old man looked at him with an interested gaze. In a calm voice, he asked who he was. After all, it was only the first year. But they had already won the magic tournament, defeating the strongest students of their academy. This kind of thing didn't happen often, if not ever. Lime just turned around to look at him and silently stared. It's not an understatement to say that this young man is one of the strongest students in the academy. Suddenly, Eddie's teacher's silhouette appeared out of nowhere. Lime stood and looked at them with an incomprehensible gaze, silently holding the goblet in his hands. Eddie's teacher ran up to him, his secretary standing beside him. There was a mask of horror and incomprehension on the man's face. He said for the boy already realized that he had been tried to be killed countless times in this tournament. There were anxious spectators in the stands. It was a shock to them. It was not allowed to be rude at the tournament. The voice said that those who dared to do so would be severely punished. Lowering his head, the man apologized for the young man having to endure all that hell. Lime smiled and said that there was no need to apologize. He had fought to win this tournament, and he was glad that he was able to challenge a difficult opponent. The boy looked at the gray-bearded old man carefully. This grandfather is a magician, and a very powerful one at that. He began to speak in a sad voice. All the stands froze in anticipation now. Something completely unusual was going to happen. Old man still is sad who told us he wanted Lime's personal opinion on what their academy was missing. The kid wondered. It turns out that the academy accepts students at any time. But as soon as he was inside those walls, he saw the exact opposite of the stated attitude. Eddie's teacher's words about his race came to mind. Also, he remembered Nero's words towards his new friend. He remembered that guy saying that kobolds shouldn't eat among demons. That spirit of racism permeated the entire academy. The guy thinks that the curriculum itself is not bad at all, but the discrimination comes from the heart of the academy, starting with the dormitory by rank, and ending with teachers discriminating against others based on race. Eddie's teacher, along with the secretary, didn't know where to put themselves in fear. Their eyes widened to the point where they looked like they were about to fall out of their orbits. The elder suddenly realized everything. Then he should fire those two first. He looked towards the teacher and the secretary. The old man thanked the boy. He would take all his words into consideration. After which, the old man retired backstage. Lime looked jeeringly in the direction of the teachers who had allowed themselves to treat all the students like this all this time. Eddie's teacher, along with the secretary, couldn't believe their ears. Could they really be fired? The women screamed that she had nothing to do with it. Shortly after the battle, Lime met up with his other Buttercup near the entrance to the Colosseum. Buttercup congratulated his friend on his victory with a smile in his eyes. Lime thanked him. He too was happy that his friend was his final opponent. His effort was simply superb. Lime had a friendly smile on his face. Buttercup stretched and nodded his head. That's right, he'd done a good job. The rays of the setting sun, and for nothing did the sky shine with its light. By the way, Lime said he wanted to ask Buttercup something, but he didn't get a chance to say anything. As soon as the boy heard that, he rushed at his friend. Shall I ask? Buttercup? He'll do anything if Lime says so. Finally something he can do for his friend. The main characters even got a little scared from such determination, and covered himself with his hands. This guy seemed to be a lot more determined than he looked at first glance. His voice became serious, and Lime said that he was going to leave the academy soon. His gaze became a little sad. When Buttercup heard that, he also felt sad. His friend had just gotten here and was already leaving. Lime replied that he had his own reasons for leaving this place. Lime, however, had one request. The boy hid his face even more tightly with his hood, and his voice made Sahim. Suddenly he raised his gaze and looked at the men. In a loud voice, he asked him if he could promise him that he would remain his ally for the rest of his life. Buttercup was a little taken aback by such a request. An ally? But they are friends as it is, Lime continued. He asked in a serious voice. Would Buttercup be able to call him his friend even if the king himself and his entire retinue declared him an enemy? Buttercup didn't understand anything at all. Why was he talking about such a thing so suddenly? Lime was silent and looked at his friend with a serious gaze. He didn't have much of a choice, but he wanted to have at least one ally in this world. Buttercup nodded his head in a friendly way. He agrees he will remain his friend forever after all. They shook hands firmly. Buttercup looked at his comrade with friendly warmth. He would never betray him no matter what the cost. Lime turned to his comrade one last time. Lastly, he wanted to tell him something important. Lime's voice was as serious as possible. He wanted to admonish his friend for the time to come. The guy said that Buttercup's sword skills had improved significantly. He only defeated him due to his tricks. Without that, he would have definitely lost. People wondered, had his skills improved? Lime waved goodbye to his friend. The sunset rays illuminated his figure and made him look like a fairy tale. His comrade also waved goodbye. He was full of hope that someday they would meet again, and no longer as adversaries, but as true allies. The sunset rays illuminated the tall towers of the academy with their warmth. Life went on there, but the protagonist had to move on, leaving behind the stages he had passed. The boy walked confidently along the paving stones, as if he didn't notice anything around him. He was moving towards new adventures, full of confidence in his abilities. Suddenly he heard whose voice it was. A funny voice, I was alert. The voice said to his very well acquainted, and someone's figures formed beside him, approaching the guy with quick steps. It was his sister Lily and her friend Miyu. They laughed and grabbed the guy by both arms in a tight hug. Lime was a little shocked at this sudden appearance. His sister laughed and said that she didn't expect anything less from his big brother. Along with them was the goblin fairy. She looked at the boy with a cheerful look and smiled. Miyu shyly said that Lim-san was very cool at that performance. His sister looked at him with a look of admiration. She said that she had told everyone in the village how Lime had beaten them all at once. Miyu looked at the boy with a pleading look and asked in a whisper if he would go to the village with them. The boy laughed and thanked the girls for coming to support him in the competition. A little in the distance stood the elf princess, and quietly watched everything happening from behind a large tree pillar. She didn't realize, who were all these kids? What were they doing here? A look of incomprehension shone on her face, she realized, and hid behind a tree with her arms around her head. And why is she hiding here in the first place? More goblins appeared out of nowhere and rushed towards the boy with cheers of joy. They were glad to have their big brother back. The children surrounded him on all sides and greeted him with cheers of joy. They asked the big brother to play with them. The children stretched their hands toward him and looked at the boy with interest. He was wearing some very strange clothes that interested them. It looked really cool. The main character didn't know where to put himself. There were too many kids, and he felt a little embarrassed. The boy shifted his worried gaze to the side, as if he saw something important there. In the distance stood an old man, the oldest man in the village. He too had come to greet the boy and to inquire about his progress. He looked at him from under his bushy eyebrows and smiled silently. It was evident that the old man was very glad to see his pupil. In a joyful tone, the old man said that their village was beginning to prosper, and it was all thanks to just one person, and that was Lime. Everyone in the village was overflowing with happiness. At last, they had a peaceful and quiet life. The old man thought, this guy's advice on improving the quality of life in the village came in handy. Earlier, standing in the headman's hut, the boy said that the earth in their village is very unfruitful. There is not enough water and fertilizer to grow crops, hence the lack of food for all the villagers. Lime asked the old man why they decided to settle in this particular place. The old man thought for a moment and replied that they didn't really have much choice. Their people are persecuted by everyone wherever they go. He didn't even know what they should do. Should they start looking for a new land again? The boy smiled and said it was not worth doing. After looking around the village, he realized why they were having trouble farming. This land had been cursed by someone on purpose. The old man was surprised. Such news dumbfounded him. He asked the boy if he was sure of what he was saying. The boy was sure that there were magical seals all over the village, defiling the land by sucking the life out of it. That's the reason why the land is so unproductive, and almost nothing grows here. Lime was sure it was a goblin who had put those seals on me. It was someone more powerful, with hope in his voice. The old man asked the boy if he could break the seals. The old man clung to the hope that he could resurrect his village and give its inhabitants grace. In a confident voice, Lime said that of course he could do anything. Let them rely on him. After analyzing all the circumstances, Lime concluded that in order to destroy all the seals at once, it was necessary to destroy the largest seal that hangs over the village. Someone has deliberately trapped the goblins, forcing them to live in this land but not even giving them a means of sustenance. The boy began to pull his dreams out of their sheaths and prepare to free this village from the curse after all. With his gaze, he immediately identified the location of the most important seal. Whoever it is will pay for this. The guy swung his sword in a huge, powerful energy wave from magic and shattered the most important seal through the air. Well, it was all over now. With confidence in his voice, the boy told you that everything would now be fine from the village. The land was no longer cursed, and the water spring near the village would soon be restored. After that, happiness finally came to the goblin village. There was plenty of food and everyone had a job and their own occupation. Lily said that since her brother had come to visit them, would he like to try their new dishes? The girl's eyes shone with joy. The rest of the goblin children lit up with happiness. They would have a feast. Cheers of joy began to be heard everywhere. Lime smiled and said he'd love to be a part of it. He wanted to rest after all the adventures he'd had. Soon they started cooking. All the tables were overflowing with delicious food, and the fragrant smell was spreading everywhere. And just like that, his weekend in the goblin village was over. The food that her sister and her friend had prepared was really delicious. On this day, bright smiles adorned the faces of all citizens. The guy thought that if the goblin goddess saw all this, she would be very happy. At this time, the woman from above was watching all of this. A fleeting smile flashed across her face, but only a little bit would make her happy. The events moved to the house where Lime slept. He had had a good rest and was now full of energy for new accomplishments. Lily and Miyu burst into the boy's room and started to wake him up. There was a glint of joy in the girl's eyes. They were very happy to see him. The guy greeted them with a gentle voice, and a wide smile stretched across his face. He was also very happy to see them. "Well, it's time for him to go back to the academy now," said the boy sadly. He didn't want to leave this cozy place, but the adventure was waiting for him. The girls were surprised so soon. "But he just arrived yesterday, why so soon?" The girls smiled. Since the guy was already leaving, they would like to give him a small gift. Miyu extended her hand to him. Lime accepted the gift. It was a small bracelet with colorful stones. He looked at it in surprise. What was it? Miyu looked at it with admiration and said that she made this bracelet together with Lily. His sister said it's an amulet. It will protect little brother from everything bad. Lily's eyes filled with happiness. She really wanted to keep her favorite little brother safe. The boy looked at the gift with gratitude. He had already managed to put it on his hand. He thanked the girls sincerely for the surprise. It was time for him to go, and the girls waved goodbye to him. They would look forward to his return. A goblin fairy flew into the room. "So," she asked the guy, "is he going to have an audience with the king? He's going to be tough to beat." With confidence in his voice, the guy told the woman not to worry. He already had a plan. Lime's eyes sparkled with confidence. He looked sternly ahead. "The boy won't lose by any means." The fairy hesitated. This was very strange. The boy's confidence even frightened her a little. After all, this adventure promised to be dangerous, even deadly. Very thoughtfully, the girl asked, "Then how does the guy know everything about him?" She quickly flew up to the guy's very face. "Is he definitely a goblin?" There was a look of disbelief in her gaze. Lime looked at her with confusion. What did she suspect? After a moment, he grinned wryly. "Of course, he's just a regular goblin. No need to worry about anything." The boy smiled, and his eyes glowed green. The Demon King sat on his monstrous throne. He was dressed in black armor on which multicolored gems sparkled. The demon's face twisted into a wry smile. He was very interested in how this whole story would end. All this time, the king was being watched by the boy. His eyes were glowing yellow. Lime told Fairy she'd see for herself. Let her climb in now. He pulled back the pocket of his robe for Fairy to slide into. A sign appeared in front of the guy now. "You had to click here." The guy pointed his finger right at it. A magical symbol immediately formed underneath him and glowed with a bright blue color. The fairy was surprised. Had he mastered teleportation as well? Why wasn't she even surprised? There was a playfulness and thoughtfulness in her eyes. Lime looked at her with a smile. He could now teleport to any place he had previously traveled to. It's quite a convenient way to travel. In fact, he needed to pick up an invitation to an audience. Lime threw his hood over himself and, clutching a piece of paper in his hand, prepared to teleport. Soon they found themselves in front of the massive black doors that led into the king's throne room. Guards stood by them holding massive axes. It seemed that not a single fly could get past them. Seeing the kid, the guard tensed up. He ordered him to stand. Seeing the one who came to them, the guard said in a thunderous voice that a lowly demon like the guy didn't belong here. Let him go away. Lime calmly pulled the invitation to the king's audience from his pocket and unfolded the piece of paper in front of the guard. Even with that, he wouldn't let him through. When he saw the paper, the guard seemed to hesitate. His breath hitched and he couldn't say a word. Finally realizing who stood before him, the guard bowed and stammered a shy apology. He invited the boy to come inside. As expected from the castle of one of the 7 generals of the Demon King, it had an imposing appearance. The boy looked at the huge castle building with interest. The fairy looked out of his pocket and asked wryly, "Did he come to look at the castle views?" The boy replied that he wasn't, and she was well aware of that. He's just trying to distract himself a little. Suddenly, an unfamiliar sound came to the boy's ear. He became alert and looked in the direction of the sound. A man appeared in front of him. He was dressed in a neat black suit. Outwardly, not a single flaw was visible on him. It was obvious that this man was meticulous about his appearance. The man said in a soft voice that they were waiting for him. The castle of the Demon King. The center gate. There was a guard standing beside it, also guarding every inch of the entrance. The hooded figure stepped closer to him and apologized for disturbing him. The guard turned his formidable gaze on him and asked in a stern voice, "Who the hell is he? And what is he doing here?" The hooded figure said in a timid voice that he must have gotten overexcited and forgotten the invitation in his room. Could he pass it on? The guard didn't know what to say. The man in armor told the man to go, but quickly. The hooded figure nodded and looked gratefully into the guard's face. The stranger smiled, drained the bandage hiding him from his face. The hall was truly enormous. Tall columns stood beside a luxurious carpet that stretched far ahead. In the distance, the huge throne of the Demon King stood tall. The kid remembered that in the game, this hall was the place to fight, with the most dangerous boss. He'd finally gotten to him. The boy's face twisted in a satisfied grimace. His plan was about to come to fruition. He had gone through all this trouble for a reason. The Demon King was sitting on his throne. His appearance was terrifying. His skin was dark in color and covered in multiple armors. The throne was to match his king. It was covered in gold, and the seat was woven of red silk. The Demon King looked at the newcomer and greeted him with a loud voice. It was one of the generals of the Demon King's army, the cruel King Dior. He had often fought him in the game, but it felt different in person. Lime was visibly tense, and it was obvious that although he had his strength, he wasn't fully prepared to face such a formidable opponent. The boy bowed and thanked the king for the invitation. He said he was a student of magical arts at the Goblin Academy named Lime. The king said in his formidable voice that he knew who the kid was, and he watched all of his fights at the tournament. Is the guy really from the Goblin race? Doubt could be heard in the Demon King's voice. He scrutinized the newly arrived kid. Lime calmly and seriously said, "That's right. He's a regular goblin." The guy said that he practiced every day to achieve such results. The Demon King didn't believe it again. Did he really do it all by himself? Even mastered the dark arts on his own? The Demon King thought for a moment. He still couldn't believe that an ordinary petty goblin was able to achieve such results alone. Lime stared at him intently, and there was an awkward second of silence. There was a look of wariness in the boy's eyes. He braced himself for the possibility that this Demon King might attack him now. But all was well. The king raised his hand and said he was already better off if the lad joined their army in the future. Such strong fighters their kingdom needed. There was even a touch of pride in the demon's voice. The king pointed to the weapons rack and said the guy could choose any weapon from the ones here. On the weapons rack stood the cursed sword Arendite. It was enveloped in a dark, demonic aura. It seemed that the very sight of this weapon would cause pain to its wielder. In addition, the tincture stood a powerful demonic wing shield. It was forged from the strongest material in the universe. No weapon in the world could penetrate it. The tincture also stood the magical Hades chain armor. It was shrouded in powerful chains and a red gem gleamed in the middle. The armor also exuded the strongest magical aura. Space itself seemed to shrink around this terrifying armor. Lime looked at these weapons carefully. All these things. Legendary weapons that could be beaten out of a boss with a low chance of falling out. And now, he was standing in front of them. He pondered, and yet what should he choose? The choice was very wide, but the boy stopped his gaze on the demon ball. When the demon saw this, he raised his hand and said, "So be it." The sword flew up to the Demon King and came down in his huge hand. In a thunderous voice, he told the boy to come to him and take his reward. Lime stepped closer and with hands shaking with excitement accepted the offering. The Demon King bellowed that he trusted the servants to mine a special stone to decorate his throne room. The kid looked at him with a question. What is he talking about? The demon said that if this stone sensed a person with bad intentions, it would glow red. And so it happened. The stones that adorned the throne room lit up blood red. The boy opened his eyes in fright. His plan had failed. The demon swung his sword in an attempt to catch up with the guy, but he dodged just in time at the last moment. More and more trouble is brewing. Red blood began to drip onto the dark stone floor. It had gone wrong from the start. The boy braced himself to brace himself for the next blow. From the very beginning, he had fallen into his trap. The protagonist held onto his wounded side from which blood was oozing. The demon smiled predatorily and said the guy did pretty good. He was able to react so quickly to his blow. But after a second, the monster swung its huge sword again. Out of a scream, started to let out a sharp blade right at the guy. From out of nowhere, the servants of the Demon King began to appear. Ugly monsters began to crawl out of every crevice. Ugly ogres and demons with red burning eyes and mouths full of teeth rushed straight at the guy, with the firm intention of tearing him to shreds in the name of their king. The monsters in front of him stood before him. They looked at him with their eyes red with rage, and were ready to rush into battle at that second. Lime clucked his tongue. This was bad. He had to act decisively and instantly, or he would be worked to pieces. The kid was completely surrounded by these monsters. They had him in a ring, and now there was no way out. The Demon King growled for the kid to stay where he was, or he would die. Dior looked down at him. He said the boy could be hysterical and beg for mercy, but he would be punished worse than death for such thoughts. Suddenly, it was as if something had gotten to the guy. Sherry opened his eyes and thought. Suddenly, a smile stretched across his face. He said, "Let the demon not misunderstand him. He wasn't going to beg him for mercy." And since he knew his intentions, there was no point in hiding them. The protagonist's face took on a manly look. He looked at the Demon King. It seemed that fear had completely disappeared from his mind, and now he was ready to fight to the death. The boy and the monster's gazes crossed. The demon asked him in surprise, "Is he serious now?" The boy's voice was completely determined. He sounded completely serious. The guy mocked him and said that the demon could certainly throw tantrums and beg for mercy, but it wouldn't work on him. Hearing such a speech, the king became furious and clenched the hilt of his huge sword even more tightly. A predatory smile appeared on his face. He could not tolerate such a boorish attitude towards his great one. Lime was ready for anything. He got into a fighting stance, his body tensed to the last muscle. Now a historic battle was about to take place. Not only his life, but the lives of all goblins depended on it. In fury, the Demon King shouted in rage to his servants to immediately finish off this impudent man. The horde of monsters heard their lord's order and immediately rushed straight at the guy. They roared like crazy. In a split second, the creatures were near the guy, but he managed to bounce away in time. Lime turned to the fairy and ordered her to heal his wounds immediately. The fairy hesitated. It all seemed useless to her, but there was no way out. There was no way out. She began to use the healing spell intensely. The guy suddenly felt his strength slowly leaving him. Suddenly he realized that it was all because of the bleeding debuff imposed by this very sword of Arendite. The protagonist jumped onto one of the tall pillars to get away from the monsters. Down below, they were already innumerable. The hordes of creatures were staring at him with their red, burning eyes, eager to tear their victim here and now. These monsters were like zombies staring at their prey. There was nothing but boundless bloodlust in their eyes. To get to the Demon King, we had to deal with his soldiers. One of those things had already grabbed onto a column and was climbing up trying to get to the guy. Even though he was alone, he had the strength of an entire raid. A dark, magical aura began to appear around him. And after a second, he cast a powerful spell that swept straight at the undead horde with great speed, tearing them to pieces. Suddenly he noticed that those things started destroying columns to get to him. A terrifying gargoyle was already bearing down on the guy from behind, thrusting its sharp claws forward. But then, the main character walked right out from under her nose. The gargoyle barely had time to slow down, and whipped her head around in surprise, trying to find her victim. The guy used an illusion spell just in time, and walked right out from under the noses of those nasty things. But they weren't backing down. Already a new armada was lumbering straight at him. But he had his own spell for that too. The protagonist used the dark magic of shadow threads to shackle these monsters. The creatures did not expect such a turn of events. They were now restrained and could not move. The guy pulled them towards him with force, and began to scatter the vile monsters in different directions. In addition, he used a spell to incinerate the vile creatures. The Demon King looked at it in surprise. What the hell is going on here? His army can't handle one kid. This is simply unthinkable. At this time, Lime was calmly massacring the demons one by one. The next spell was already burning in his hand. Who would be his next victim? His face transformed. It was now burning with the excitement of battle. One of the creatures was already coming at him from behind. It was a huge, one-eyed ogre, but the guy reacted in time and swung his sword right in front of the vile creature's face. He jumped high up, clutching his ghost sword of dark magic tightly in his hand. The creature didn't have time to react and fell to the floor with a clatter. The Demon King watched the carnage with a smile. He was incredibly happy with all this incredible cruelty. But suddenly the creature that had barely grabbed the protagonist fell to the floor, impaled by multiple swords. Seeing this, the Demon King became even angrier. This annoying little kid is about to kill his entire army. Out of nowhere, goblins in armor began to appear. They came to the aid of their savior. Each of them was ready to give his life for the freedom of his race. The old bearded goblin leader said that he was very happy to help his master. The goblin army was beginning to be infused with the dark energy of its creator. Now each of these warriors was worth a dozen demons. The Goblin King with his army, shrouded in many clouds of dark magic. Lime focused his serious and wary gaze directly on his main target, the Demon King. All he needed, all he'd been working for all this time, was to kill the bastard. The boy stood firmly on his feet. It seemed to me that nothing in the world could move him. He was determined to fulfill his long-held dream, to give the goblins their long-awaited freedom. Now that the Demon King's army had been destroyed, they were facing each other one-on-one. No one would be able to stop them. The Demon King stood before him in all his terrifying Russia and held demonic weapons in his hands. Well, now they would move on to the second round. Dark magic began to condense around the guy, infusing his body with power. The Demon King saw all this and shouted with anger. He would make this insolent man beg for mercy. Lime didn't listen to him anymore, but simply jumped back, dodging the king's powerful blows. He concentrated all his dark magical energy and launched a powerful spell at the king. Lime stared straight at his opponent with concentration, nothing but determination and cold calculation in his eyes. The future fate of his family depended on this battle. He grasped his sword and crouched on the pillar, preparing to repel countless blows. The Demon King smirked at him, and Riley said that running away forever wouldn't work. The monsters were climbing the columns towards the guy in an unceasing stream, and he in turn fearlessly chopped their ghastly bodies with a single blow. The poor man felt that his strength was about to leave him. The Demon King noticed it too, and his kin contorted in an even greater grimace of joy. Was he already exhausted? The flow of the monster kept on going. There appeared to be no end to them. One monster after another climbed the tall columns and tried to grab the boy with its ugly paws. Lime smirked and looked at the king with a smile. He said he thought their battle was already moving toward the end. The king screamed with anger. He said that's exactly how it was going to be, because pretty soon he's going to kill that fucking goblin. Lime eyed the king warily and concentrated. He purposely avoided his army in order to accumulate magical power. Now that everything was ready, the final touch could be applied. The guy cast a spell and magic light began to spread in different directions. The body of the protagonist is enveloped by a dark magical energy. Following the light out of this impenetrable darkness, let him appear at his call and do his bidding. Goblin King. The concentration of magical energy reached its limit. Soon the majestic silhouette of the Goblin King appeared out of the mist. It was an old man with a lush gray beard and strong hair. A majestic crown gleamed on his head. The king stood on the magical symbol that summoned him, in the world of the living. He had a good-natured smile on his face. Now things would go a lot easier. The Demon King was not a little surprised when he saw all this. What the hell is this? Who is this? Did this kid just summon one goblin? This is ridiculous. The Goblin King stood before him in all his glory, shrouded in magical energy. Deer was ready to burst out in laughter. He was amused by the boy's attempt to defeat him. Now the demons were once again coming straight at the protagonist. At this time, Lime just smiled. It was the Goblin King after all. And the king has his servants. The Goblin King raised up his golden rod and began to call his army. The demonic brats squawked at the bright magical color. Dead creatures began to appear out of the darkness. It was the Goblin King's army of the dead. With every passing second, more and more of them were forming countless troops of the Goblin army. Now they were ready to rush into battle for their ruler. Soon these goblins were already countless in number. There was no end to this army in sight. The strongest magical energy emanated from them, which infused the bodies of the rebellious goblins with incredible power. The Demon King didn't realize what had just happened. A summoned spirit was able to summon someone else. This was unthinkable. Did that little fellow really think he could defeat him in numbers? Lime replied that he was a goblin, and goblins are strong when they are united. The demon army rushed at the goblins with screams, in an attempt to tear them to shreds. But these creatures were not so simple. They covered themselves with shields and attacked with sharp spears. The mindless demons couldn't penetrate their defenses. Shouts of fierce battle rang out everywhere, neither side willing to concede. Goblins and demons mingled in the one stream, and now it was impossible to tell who was where. The king's hall was filled with the screams of fierce battle. Blood was pouring from both sides. Goblin archers clad in light armor drew their bows to fire sharp arrows and shoot down the flying demons. A few seconds later, their arrows reached their target, and the demon dragons began to fall down with howls. With each passing second, the goblin army was growing exponentially. Now it was much larger than the Demon King's army, and they could easily handle their opponent. The Demon King slowly boiled with rage. This guy had never killed anyone with his own hands. Lime smirked and said he'd take those words as a compliment. The boy's face was full of joy and battle excitement. The Demon King began to amass all of his incredible power to finally defeat this petty goblin who dared to disturb his peace in such a brazen manner. Lime was wary. His opponent was very strong, even the air in the hall became heavier from his dark magic. And since that's the case, the axe and the guy to show him what he's worth. Concentrating all his power in one hand, he began to use his most powerful spell. The goblin fairy screamed at him that he was an idiot. His wounds. It's not like he's still not recovered, it's dangerous. The guy realized it was impossible, all because of the bleeding that his sword was inflicting. Since that's the case, he must defeat the Demon King before his strength finally runs out. The boy grasped his sword to deliver another blow to this vile monster that made his mind suffer. He stood in front of the Demon King, who seemed even more majestic and terrifying up close. The protagonist held his sword with both hands, trying his best to block his opponent's blows. The Demon King looked at him with a predatory gaze, and slowly began to be covered in fire. The boy was wary. This was something new. He had to be extremely careful or the Demon King would just burn him to the ground. While trying to dodge, the guy lost his guard, and the Demon King immediately took advantage of it. Lime barely ducked in time to avoid the fatal blow. The blade of the Demon King's blade passed a few centimeters from his face. A second more, and the boy would have been finished. He ran aside, and the Demon King grew 2 more arms. He looked even more terrifying now. The guy was surprised. He had 4 arms. He didn't have that design in the game, and when using fire magic, the king throws the target into a gravity cage that is impossible to escape from. In a second, the guy was in a cage that bound his movements. The Demon King laughed caustically. Now he definitely holds victory over this petty goblin. But then suddenly he saw something he hadn't expected. His eyes squinted and his heart seemed to skip a beat. The guy behind the bloodstains was still on his feet from the last of his strength. He gathered all his will into a fist. He couldn't give up, or his entire exposed body would be exterminated. Despite his wounds, he continued to smile. He asked the Demon King, is it so hard for him to believe who he is that he survived? Behind his radiant smile, he hid his anxiety. He had almost no strength left. He hadn't expected the battle against the king to be so hard. Deer said he was even curious how long the kid could hold out against him. Having accumulated enough magical energy, he swung his sword and dashed towards the protagonist. Now he would finish him off. A powerful force that it seemed like space itself was about to fall apart. The monster swung his sword in an attempt to catch the boy, but he dodged skillfully, even though he had almost no strength left. The blade of the blade passed only a few centimeters from the lime's face, but suddenly the guy was distracted by something in the heat of battle and looked away. At this moment, a sword was already flying towards him at full speed. If he didn't parry this attack, then he was definitely finished. The blow was so strong that the poor fellow was slammed into the wall, and splinters of stone flew from him in different directions. He lay on the floor almost exhausted, unable to move even a finger. The battle had worn him out so badly. The boy was breathing heavily, his heart beating at an extremely high rate. Blood dripped down his face and his eyes struggled to focus on anything. 1090 Dior looked at him and smiled predatorily. Was he already exhausted? But now the king would finish him off. Lime held onto his sword and pulled his hood even tighter over his head. His weapon glowed with magical energy even more, and he needed to strengthen it as much as possible. The Demon King roared that he was just getting started after all. Lime didn't know what he was talking about. His eyes reflected fear. Right now, he didn't have enough strength to continue fighting at full strength, the Demon King said, recognizing that he was a fine warrior throughout their battle, never letting his guard down for a second. There was respect in those words, even though they were sworn enemies. The Demon King continued. He said the guy was watching his every move and dodging his *** perfectly. As a sign of respect, he will kill him quickly and painlessly. Lime tensed his whole body now. He needed to either dodge or fend off the attack, but he had almost no strength left. The Demon King had already released his fire spell at him. There was no way the guy would have time to dodge. The fairy already wanted to cover him with her body, and at the cost of her life save her master. But suddenly she saw something strange. Turning around, her face transformed and gained an expression of surprise. The fairy fell to the ground, hit by a strong magical wave. Suddenly Letty appeared out of nowhere. Her eyes were full of determination. She said in a serious voice that she would take revenge on the Demon King. The girl was standing and did not see the danger approaching her from behind. The goblin fairy struggled to recover from such a blow, and only lay exhausted on the ground with her wings folded. The protagonist held Letty in his arms. The girl was almost completely exhausted. Her eyes were closed and her chest was barely heaving. From her powerful spell, she had used up too much mana. The boy turned to the fairy and said that someone here needed to restore their mana supply. The fairy cheerfully said that for her heroes she would spare nothing. She began to transfer her mana supply to the girl so that she could finally regain her strength. Lime looked affectionately at his friend, needing to protect her at all costs. Suddenly, a sign with information popped up beside him. He looked in the other direction to see if danger was approaching them. The guy looked carefully at the skill plate. He now had a new, unique skill. On top of that, he's got Erendite. Not bad, now his power will increase by leaps and bounds. The boy scrutinized the skills he had managed to pick up during the battle with the demon. Letty was already awake, and she tried to open her eyelids with the last of her strength. She didn't understand what was happening, or even where she was. The protagonist leaned over her and looked warmly into the girl's face. He said in a calm voice that he had defeated the Demon King, and it was all thanks to her. Hearing this, the girl was unspeakably happy and looked at the guy with eyes shining with joy. Suddenly she realized that Lime was holding her in his arms. She immediately blushed with embarrassment, and in a stammering voice asked him to put her in her place. The guy stared at her with an incomprehensible look. He knelt down and the girl covered her face with her hands and blushed even more. She was terribly embarrassed. Lime dropped the girl from his arms and she immediately fell to the ground. Realizing what she'd done, the boy immediately started apologizing to her. Letty started to rise to her feet, leaning on the cold stone floor. She said it was no big deal. The girl shook herself off, and her face once again sparkled with her usual enthusiasm and joy. But not a couple seconds later, she blanched again and flushed with all her might. It wasn't the first time Lime had held her in his arms, but at least this time he didn't send her flying. The guy turned to the girl. The girl turned to him and still redder asked him what he wanted. Stuttering, the guy timidly said that the girl never told him what she was even doing here. His look made everything serious again. First of all, he would like to thank her from the bottom of his heart. The protagonist put his hand to his chest and bowed. It was only because of her that he was able to defeat the Demon King. A grateful smile appeared on the guy's face. Letty waved it off and said with a smile that it was okay. It was just her job. But it was obvious from the girl's face that she was pleased that the boy had finally noticed her efforts. They were standing across from each other and talking embarrassedly. The girl couldn't stop blushing with embarrassment. She blushed again when she looks at the guy. She falls in love with him even more. She finally admitted to herself that she had been in love with this man from the beginning. The fairy just watched all this in silence. She was terribly curious as to how this whole story would end. The girl, apparently noticing her gaze on herself, stammered and began to deny everything. She had already said everything she wanted to say. The boy asked the girl how come she knew he was in the king's castle, and how did she find her way here. The girl made serious and said it was a very long story. Someday she would tell it to him. It was obvious that it was hard for the girl to talk about it, but she still said that in truth, she entered the academy for the same purpose as the guy. The girl's gaze sank. She was the princess of the Dark Elves meant to avenge all her people. Lime looked at her in surprise, a turn of events he hadn't expected. Had this girl been nurturing the same hope and purpose as he had all this time? Surprisingly, this fragile creature was much stronger and more determined than he thought at first glance. Guy even felt embarrassed for a moment because he hadn't taken her seriously at first. Letty continued to talk, and with each word she became sadder and sadder. Yes, that's right, she's a princess, but her side is no longer on the world map. More specifically, her country no longer belongs to the Dark Elves. It's been completely taken over by demons. With sadness in her voice, she said that they had become a puppet state. No, more like a regular colony. With each passing word, it became more and more difficult for her. It was evident that she was overwhelmed with grief and despair that her country was no longer in the possession of its original owners. The girl told me that her father, the king of the Dark Elves, was put into an artificial coma so he couldn't interfere with anyone. The friends stood in the ruins of the Demon King's castle now. This monster can't hurt anyone, but after all that the elf woman's father had done for his people, now their best mages are being used to siphon off magical energy. Several dark elves stood in a circle and used one group spell. It was like someone was siphoning magic power out of them. Lime listened attentively to the girl's story. At the end, he asked in a serious voice why she followed him to King Diur's castle. It was very dangerous, right? The girl resolutely offered her hand to her chest and said in a confident tone that this was why she had entered the academy. To meet the king and take his sword from him. That was her true mission. With every word the girl said, Lime realized more and more how much he and she were alike. The girl continued. If she could only succeed in taking his sword, then. She paused as if trying to collect her thoughts. Letty clenched her fist confidently. And overcoming embarrassment and pain, she said that then she would be able to free her people from eternal oppression. The boy listened to her carefully and understood. He was surprised that their goals were almost identical. But then the girl fought herself. Though, to be honest, she said she hadn't expected them to have such similar goals. The kid looked at her with a gentle smile. At this time, someone's bony hand began to appear from the magic circle. Everything was still just beginning. The girl thought about it for a moment and said in a suspicious tone that he was indeed too strong for an ordinary goblin. Lime looked away, trying to hide his suspicion. He'd wanted all this time to keep his true power a secret. But fortunately, the girl quickly forgot that. Her cheeks reddened with embarrassment again. She said it didn't matter now. She continued to look at her companion with a loving gaze. In all the time they had been together, he had become even closer to her. Lime suddenly seemed to remember something and wanted to ask something. With interest, he asked her, who exactly was now in power in the girl's country? Letty wondered. Suddenly, a thick black fog began to envelop the girl. It came out of nowhere and now covered the girl's body, as if the guy realized the irreversibility of what was happening. He called out to the two of them and told them to run away from there immediately. The nightmarish face of a skeleton began to appear out of the thick black fog. His voice sounded like a thunderclap. Letty turned to him and in a belligerent tone asked what he was doing here. The skeleton seemed to pay no attention to her. He turned his death-glowing eyes on the protagonist. He wondered, is this kid a goblin? That's just impossible. A mutant? That was very curious. The monster that crawled out from the very depths of hell was scrutinizing the protagonist with her gaze. This guy exudes so much dark, magical energy. He is also one of the generals of the Demon King's army. Letty had already prepared to cast her spell and drew the arrow of her magic bow. But the guy shouted for her to stop. The skeleton simply vaporized the arrow fired from his bow. With disappointment in his voice, he said that the Dark Elves, as always, did not impress him in any way. Before Letty could even blink her eyes, a cloud of dark magical energy was near her. The girl ducked down to defend herself, but then a lime spell appeared out of nowhere. It started to break the magical shackles. The girl looked surprised at everything that was happening. The main character's loud voice came from far away. The guy was determined, his body once again covered in dark magic energy. In a loud voice, he said, "Wouldn't dare to harm his dear friend." The Hellspawn looked at the kid with interest. Lime finally remembered where he'd seen the magic circle from which the Lich had emerged. It covered his entire village, making the soil unfertile and drying up the rivers. Hearing the boy's words, Letty blushed even more with embarrassment. Her heart felt like it was going to jump out of her chest. Leech pondered. He realized he was right after all. His colleagues totally underestimated the guy's looks. He wondered if he should make him his guinea pig. What did he think about that? Lime stood and looked at the Hellspawn with a menacing stare. But first, Leech said he needed to get rid of some pesky bugs. He was definitely alluding to the fairy and the elf queen. He held out his bony hand to cast a spell of destruction. The elf's body was thrown aside and she fell to the ground with a clatter, losing consciousness instantly. Lime turned to his friend, looking at her exhausted body out of horror. A girl lay unconscious on earth. She had a ghost blade sticking out of her chest. Everything seemed to swim in the guy's eyes. The man he loved was lying there now, but he couldn't do anything to help him. The giant skeleton smiled and asked if the guy didn't notice his mana streams. The skeleton's appearance was covered by a dark magic aura. The lich's face transformed, becoming even more terrifying. His voice sounded as if from the very depths of hell. "What choice would the goblin make?" he asked. Lime looked at him with a baleful, close-toothed stare. "What other choice is there? Does he have a choice?" Space began to break apart and a portal appeared there. It was the portal to the goblin village. It was engulfed in flames. The demon spawn laughed thunderously. Whose life will the goblin choose? Will he choose to save his village or his singing friend? Lime was furious. He screamed in impotent anger. His eyes were filled with anger and a desire to avenge his loved ones. Lich looked at him through the streams of his dark energy and pointed with his bony finger. It was just beginning.